Well, good morning to you.
Good morning. It's morning for me. What time is it for you?
It's almost time to go to bed. It's
Oh, there we go.
four. It's 4:30 here in the glorious coast of California.
10:30 for me in the morning. So I'm on coffee number two.
Uh, and you are Thursday, and I am still on Wednesday.
Yes, I come to you from the world of tomorrow. It still exists for now. The sun's out.
So,
Chance of
so
rain later
tomorrow.
on.
I was going to say, so tomorrow, did we annex Canada yet? But okay.
Not yet. Not yet. I'm waiting for the news to break.
Let me know so I can invest in flags here the day before.
Absolutely. I will send you a message on the wire.
And this is why I love military history, because we can go backwards and talk about the crazy things people used to do.
Hindsight is 2020.
I know. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. I really love the plane episodes you do.
Thank you.
And I'm one of those ground people that I stick to the ground. I have a little
Yep.
shovel. I dig into holes. I dress up like plants, and the army thing. And
Yeah.
my fondest memories of the Air Force is usually them flying overhead, dropping things on us.
Yes.
I mean ours.
Yes. Like usually they don't land on you, but sometimes there is a bit of human error and things get a bit too close to home.
or windows get broken, but that's kind of
Yeah.
fun. But so, how did you get started on being the premier historian for airplanes?
Well, long story short, it was COVID. I was out of work. I was bored. I had this giant book collection, and this is only a tiny bit of it. Someone at the time was like, "Oh, why don't you just start doing YouTube videos about planes? You've got nothing better to do with your time." And I was like, "You know what? Yeah, I'll give that a crack." And I put up some basic, like, sort of 9-10 minute summary videos. A couple were actually from scripts that I'd written years ago when I'd briefly contemplated doing YouTube a couple of years before, but gave up. So I started it again. Did the channel for about 3 months, and then I woke up one morning, and it was like Christmas Eve, I think, actually, and I'd gone from like 300 or 400 subscribers to suddenly I woke up and it's like, you have 22,000 subscribers and like a ridiculous amount of views. I'm like, what has happened? Like it just blew up instantly overnight, and then the momentum didn't really stop, and I'm like, okay, this is becoming a thing. and so like the next year, like 2022, was like this really big learning curve of how to sort of make the videos a bit more consistent and get the research a bit more kind of down to an art form, and figuring out, am I going to do things in a concise order? Am I going to do things chronologically, or am I just going to make a list and pick things in order of what I want to do, and that sort of thing? And then I started sort of making other sort of friends and acquaintances in the YouTube space, people that do other history channels, and yeah, it's just snowballing from there essentially. Like it started off just as a way to not go mad during the lockdowns and with boredom, and now it's a job, which is still unreal.
That's kind of how it went for me too. I mean,
Yeah.
one of my degrees is in history, and I studied military history.
Yeah.
And I wrote books on military history, and I after I was done active, I started making movies and some TV stuff, and tried to stick within military realm, and then TV, and then COVID came, and I was on a TV show that, of course, stopped. Everything stopped, and fortunately, I'm dual citizen, so no one could keep me out of their country, and I'm sitting here. Well, I'm getting paid, sort of. I have nothing to do, no work anywhere is going on. I may as well start doing YouTube, start doing little documentaries. So, and it was, I hate to rub in everybody's face, but because I could, I got on a plane to Europe, and I used to live out there, so I never really had time then. Then went to Europe on a like $400 for a return ticket, half empty plane, car rental. Oh, thank God, there's one person who will rent a car. Oh, take it. All the hotels were empty, and I traveled all over Europe, filmed interesting places. At a discount. It was awesome. Then I went home, started uploading all of these, and like you said, no one has anything to do, so they sit at home and watch YouTube, and then it just kind of grew from there. But So did you find out what order you want to do it? Because I kind of do it. I haven't found. Sometimes I'll put it up to a vote.
Yes. So I've got a new system now where I let the Patreon supporters vote kind of for the tone of what I'm going to do for the next month. So at the moment, with the exception of a special video that I'm working on, the current flavor is Italian aircraft. And then there's going to be another vote. And they also vote on special videos as well. But I also have this thing that is known as simply the list, which is this giant mega Excel spreadsheet of video topics by categories of planes, wars, that kind of thing. And a friend recently asked me, are you ever going to run out of material to do videos? And I said to them, I'm like, look, at the rate of the uploads that I do, that spreadsheet would take me 389 years to go through. I did the math. And that spreadsheet is still growing. So as long as like online media platforms like YouTube don't go away and people stay interested in aviation history, I'll be fine from a material standpoint.
It's interesting. It's like, tech. It's interesting tech.
Yeah, it is.
It's just like tanks and battleships, and it's one of those things that it doesn't come with an opinion. It's just really interesting, especially the screw ups.
Yes,
the screw
and all the absolutely just crazy things that they did before, computer simulations and how they tested everything. And, so much of it was like, well, the only way we're going to find out if this works is if we build a full scale practical flying thing, stick someone in it and pray that it doesn't explode.
Oh, and there's some interesting things coming up on your Italian list, I bet.
Oh, yes.
I always did like that 3-engine, the torpedo bomber they had.
Oh, the Savoy Marchetti 79. Yes, I've got a video in the works on that one. So that is
and it looks so cool.
It looks aggressive because it kind of looks like it's frowning, like with its kind of like slanted nose. It looks like a really angry bee.
It looks like a Junkers on steroids.
Yes.
Yes, like Junkers got angry.
Yeah. And like we like to kind of dunk on the Italians a lot, like with their performance in World War II, but honestly, like they fielded some pretty darn good aircraft. They just lacked the industrial capacity to basically keep up with a lot of them.
And they built some really interesting tanks and tank destroyers. They only built like one or
yeah, exactly.
They were coming up with good ideas and then they riveted them together. That didn't quite work. But their Navy, we gave to the Navy and their frogmen. They sort of had it going on for a minute there.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember after World War I, they started buying French, the small little tankettes, and sent them on to Fiat to give them to turbocharge the engine. Because it was like typical Italians, like, all right, don't really know if this works, but let's make it go faster.
Yep. It's hilarious.
I mean, it is. It is always more fun to look at the things that really sort of kind of doesn't work. Like I haven't made up my mind on the F-35 or the Osprey yet.
Yeah.
Because I look at the price and go like, holy God, how can something be how many billion over budget? Was it 3 billion over budget in
something
R&D
like
before
that.
it ever flew? Yep. And I was thinking to myself, at what point in time, when you see you going over budget, 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million, do you pick up the phone and call someone and say, brother, we're a little over budget here.
I will say I have a soft spot for the F-35, as evidenced by my photo that I have up there. But I do agree, a little bit on the expensive side these days, considering the development budget.
That's why I kind of have, for that reason, I have a little bit of a sort of a soft spot for something like the Su-27, the Russian stuff, because it kind of looks cool and it's kind of more durable. It's a little bit like the American stuff on discount. Stuff that it's like the Toyota version of the Cadillac, or not a Cadillac, but of the Benz. It's like, it's can't quite do the same, but you can't break it.
Yes.
Where you think the American high-tech planes now is, oh my God, if you put the wrong battery in, the whole plane will burn down or whatever. They're not so delicate. that was always, and that's of course a little bit why we're here today to talk about what the Ruskies have doing and what they are doing.
Yep.
And I guess it's a little bit of the Russian Air Force. I guess is a little bit a symbol of the Russian mindset. It's rugged. It may sometimes, no offense to my Russian friends, be, I hate to say simplified, but it's sort of simple, it's rugged, it's pragmatic, and it will fly or will shoot the designer.
Yeah. I mean, if it works, I call it the definition of, if it works, it works. And you want to build thing to bomb tank. Okay, yep, it flies, it bombs a tank. It doesn't do much else. It looks ugly as sin, but yes, it works.
I mean, yeah. Or do you make the tank fly?
Yeah, exactly. I really need to do a video on the tank gliding experiments that they did actually, because
yes,
the problem is there's like 3 photos. There's like 3 photos that exist of it. That's it. So it's like, oh, I need to like make some 3D models for it to use for like an illustration instead.
Did anyone ever survive this?
As far as I'm aware, the testing didn't kill anyone. I might need to triple check that. There is a book in the other room that covers some of that crazy stuff. I will admit though I haven't read it yet. It's a case of I'm always buying more textbooks to add to my collection, and then going, wait, when I'm actually going to have the time to sit down and read all the ones that I've already bought.
Oh, I have books in storage now that I just keep buying them when I see them, and eventually I'll get to them. And that's fortunately now I've gotten to the to Stalin's war and his preparations for World War II finally, because there's so many other things in there. And I was going. My trip was, I was planning to go to Russia in 22. Yeah, that got derailed ever so slightly.
Yeah, I wonder why.
And I have friends in Russia. Oh, just come on over. It's like I'm still in the military reserve here in the U.S. and
it's a bit difficult.
And I have been in Ukraine a few times since the war started, doing documentaries from there. Can we just finish the war and maybe get me a get out of jail free card or something? But the archives, I'm dying to see the archives and the museums over there. And the bookstores. If I can find antique book, I'll see what I can find in Russia. Google Translate will help you.
Yes,
but if I could, an old bookstore in Russia would be very interesting, if not for the technical manuals.
Yes.
So this what I have been discovering, having been a mainstream historian, growing up, having heard why did Hitler attack Russia? That was such a stupid thing to do. Lost the war there and then. And we also heard things like, well, Stalin, when Russia finally did, he retreated to his dacha for 2 weeks and was all despondent. And you hear all these stories, and we never got a good explanation, except Russia was unprepared. They were not ready for this. They got caught with their pants down. Stalin panicked. And as now, after the 90s, the archives became open. We got more information. It's pretty clear that that's not actually what happened. And it seems very clear that within the weeks before or around Barbarossa, Stalin was getting ready to jump off against the West himself. And it was basically just a matter of weeks. The Russian troops had been called up. The airplanes, the tanks, the fuel, the thousands of munition trains, all lined up on the frontier. And Germany was doing the same. So it was almost inevitable. And I'm trying to figure out how far back did this become inevitable, because it seems by 39, when Stalin did his deal with Molotov, with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, already then the very reasoning for that was specifically to erase anything between the two countries. So when Stalin wanted to jump over against the West, he could, without having to go through a third country. Even that was part of the planning. And my contention has then also, well, then we go back to the Kangin Gol in Manchuria that nobody ever heard about, really, where the Russians fought against the Japanese. They had 900 aircraft assigned out there. They had 628 at the highest, and 550 tanks. And this is 1,000 miles away from their closest distribution hub. They amassed all of this out there, 500 some artillery pieces. And this is almost more than the Germans had for the invasion of Poland. And this was far, far, far flung away. So the Russian, under Zhukov, where they eventually completely defeated and annihilated the Japanese, and they only lost some 250 planes of those, but you can tell me more about that. So they were cutting their teeth there. They had 648 planes to send to Spain, so it's not like they weren't building planes. And for Finland, they lost 1,000 aircraft. Yeah, they had 2,500 of them, which is more than what the Germans had for the French campaign. So when you start looking at what the Russians were doing, also with some of their armor, and I have watched some of your episodes about what the Russians were building in the 30s, and it's fascinating. And that's why I just had to ask you, what in God's name were they building? And you can start with the crazy first, because they're kind of cool.
Honestly, like what they were building was kind of, it was a product of a couple of things, because like you've got some really weird, like but ugly but surprisingly effective like aircraft, like their heavy bombers, for example, the ANC-4 and the TB3, right? Like
yes,
the one that has like the bloody open rear defensive gunners, where the gun is kind of sitting in a suspended dustbin underneath the wings.
TB3.
Yeah, that thing.
Yes,
like it's a product of a couple of different things. It's a product of the Soviets are still sort of gearing up their industry to produce all metal aircraft. You know, this is during a time when for the first time they are able to produce the metals and the alloys fully in-house without having to more or less rely on exports from, you know, Western Europe and that. So they've lagged behind a tiny bit when it comes to metallurgy. The other thing that has sort of produced a lot of the, what I would like to call the blocky Soviet aesthetic is basically the Great Purges, because some of the people that were at the forefront of aeronautical engineering in terms of airfoil design, that sort of thing, were on the naughty list, which didn't help. And this basically led to when some of these aircraft were being developed at the various, you know, gas factories, which were essentially a mix between a prison and a production line. You had the people that were working on the general airframe design, figuring out the airfoil and everything like that. They weren't always the leading person of that department, because the leading person of that department might either be fully in prison or no longer on the celestial plane, and so like their second in commands or even their apprentices were in charge of that. And that's why sometimes you get things like the TB3, where they had the capacity to make it a lot sleeker if they wanted to, but it was a case of they were under pressure. The people designing and engineering it were either inexperienced or harassed. And then there's the third thing that comes into it, which is time versus cost. Because the Soviet Air Force needed to rapidly increase its inventory, because, as you said, you know, they knew a conflict was coming. It wasn't a case of if, it was a case of when was it going to happen.
And this was the mid-30s already, wasn't it?
Yeah. And like it was like they knew it was coming, just like from an ideological struggle standpoint. Like they knew it was coming. Stalin knew it was coming. The Soviet Air Force knew it was eventually going to be coming. And so they went for and you see this during the Second World War, and to their credit, it worked. They went for quantity over quality.
Yes.
And that worked with some bombing aircraft, like the TB3 to a point, and then other things like the PE-8 had all sorts of fun hiccups, and so they ended up only building like 200 of those, or whatever ridiculously small number it was. But yeah, so during like the late 30s, you had things like the TB3 being developed, the ANC-4, which preceded it. The thing that the Soviets did really well was actually the development of some of the early monoplane fighters, like the Polikarpov I-16.
That's the ones they sent to Spain to play around with.
Yeah, the one that looks like a flying barrel, essentially, like very short, stubby, but it was really revolutionary for its time because it was, you know, it was among the first to have fully retractable landing gear. It had a fully enclosed cockpit, even though the pilots hated it and took it off. It was incredibly nimble.
There was a problems with the glass because they wouldn't have the quality of design back, so they couldn't. They would get in this right. They would get discolored in the sun.
They would get discolored in the sun, and also the sliding mechanism suffered from like ice buildup in the winter months when it was being operated like in the field in Russia and things like that. You know, it would jam, and just a lot of the pilots didn't like it. But the biggest complaint was the lack of vision because, you know, they hadn't mastered, you know, shaped glass or anything like that really. So it was all flat paneling, which meant you had this kind of bird cage of framing. Yeah. Which really hampered visibility, and the pilots are like, no, we don't want that. Just leave it open. We'll wear a hat. we get vision. You get fresh air.
And it's not cold when you're at altitude anyway at all. So that's
yeah, you know, not at all. But the thing that the I-16 did a really good job of showing was the effectiveness of cannons versus machine guns. Because the earlier I-16s had machine guns, but then the later variants started mounting the very potent Soviet cannons once they figured out the quirks of the early ones jamming, but they actually got through that pretty quickly.
Yeah, because it was underarmed, the first version with what, 1 or 2 machine guns, was it?
Yeah, the first one had rifle caliber machine guns, and then they added the heavier machine guns. And then by the time you got to things like Khalkhin Gol and the Spanish Civil War, the first variants were starting to roll out, which had the 20 millimeter cannon, 20 millimeter in the wings, which were very hard hitting, and they were the ones that inflicted a lot of the casualties in air-to-air engagements against Japanese fighters. Over Khalkhin Gol, like at the very beginning, because that sort of kicked off just as they were starting to field these heavier armed I-16s in numbers. So at the beginning, not many were at the field, and there was some level of parity between the Japanese aircraft and the Soviet aircraft. But then once these guys started rolling in, the balance tipped in the favor of the VVS.
The Japanese Zeros are completely unarmed. There's no armor or pilot protection in the Zero. I seem to remember.
No self-sealing fuel tanks, no armor protection. I think most of the things they were fielding there were they weren't the Zero. They were the previous thing, the A5Ms, the Key 27s, which had the fixed spattered undercarriage.
Oh yeah.
They fielded a lot of those there, and those were equally as fragile. Like, you know, no protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks. You score a hit in the fuel tank, and that's basically it. Yep, you're done.
Like completely obsolete compared to the I-16 anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And the I-16, you know, the later models had an insanely good power to weight ratio as well. They were very, very good. They could out accelerate the Key 27. They were equally as nimble, and most importantly, they had better guns.
And then they tried to build it's funny you should mention. I got to talk a little bit more about the TB3 before I move on with the fight, because it's so cool. But if you take the TB3, it was basically were the heaviest lift bomber of the time. There's no other country had anything like the TB3.
Yeah,
and this was what, 32, 33?
Early
30s.
I think 32, like 33, I think that was when they were still fielding the TB1, the ANT4, and then I think it was like mid 30s was when the TB3 was coming in, and that could carry something like 4 tons of bombs. I might be losing
It was more than anything comparable in any other nation, as far as I remember.
Yes, it was the heaviest bomber fielded in the world at the time, and it remained the heaviest bomber. I think when war broke out in Europe in 39, I think it was still the heaviest bomber fielded in large numbers. The French had one, the Farman F222, which could carry a comparable bomb load, but it was it didn't carry the same bombs in terms of like physical. Like the F-22 carried a lot of smaller bombs usually, whereas the Soviets had like 1,000 kilogram bombs, and they could mount a few of those in that, big bombs. If one of those lands on something, it's not going to exist the next day or even the next minute.
2-ton bombs and 3-ton. They eventually had a 3 or 4-ton bomb.
They had the 5,000 ton, the Fab 5000, which looks like you're just dropping a water cooler on someone.
But the TB3 could carry more than the B-17, couldn't it? B-17 had what, 2,000, 2 tons, 2.5 tons.
Yeah, and
depending on what range and
in its maximum configuration, the TB3 was something around the 4-ton mark.
But that was extremely advanced for that time.
Yeah, and again, it was 4-engined.
You're not building a bomber like that for self-defense or for home defense with big bombs. That again, we're looking at the type of aircraft. They're focusing on something, a frontline fighter and a long-range bomber.
Yeah.
And then the TB4 came after that, was enclosed cockpits, and the gunners weren't sitting on little sticks underneath the wings, or
yes. No, the improvements done by Petlikov in what became the PE-8 were really, really good in the aircraft. It just so happened that it was just plagued with development problems, and it was never, produced in the kind of numbers you would see, produced by the British or the American aircraft industries. Also, by that point, the the doctrine of the Soviet Air Force had shifted to basically just the full tactical support role, pumping out heaps of IL-2s, just frontline support. They weren't worried about strategically bombing German cities. They just wanted to annihilate the German army on the front line first and foremost.
That's very interesting, because they really didn't have they did have them, but didn't have a lot of long-range heavy bombers either. They were more focused on frontline support, and then they could roll their army in through Germany after they destroyed the army.
Yeah,
that was the plan, right?
Yeah, it was like on both sides, like on the Eastern Front, it was an army war first and foremost, and the Air Force was there to support what was happening on the ground. It wasn't.
Yeah, the Germans had a similar point of view, didn't they? Mm-hmm. They never really had a long-range bomber, and I guess the Condor could have sort of done it, except structurally, not really.
Yeah, it didn't like landing.
I mean, but by that time the mission is over. Damn it!
Yeah, so your plane wasn't designed for the role that it was fielding in the war. When you have to land, there is a greater than zero chance that it's going to break its back when it's unloaded.
I mean, they had the 177 that just broke the wings off. I mean,
yeah, exactly. It was only mildly flammable. The engines were definitely reliable. Oh yes.
I mean, we could do a whole talk about Goering's 4-engine dive bomber, but
we could.
277.
Yeah.
277, yeah. About the TB3. So the TB3 had 5 engines, right? Initially.
Yes. So it had. So basically, it had the 4 engines in the wing, and then there was a 5th engine that was mounted. This was more so for what became the Petlikov PE-8. There was an early exploration of what would become the TB3, where you had your 4 engines in the wing, and then there was going to be a 5th/6th mounted above the wing, sort of like you saw it a lot on various flying boats and stuff in the interwar period, where you had the extra thing. With the TB3, that was originally done to address a power deficit that they were finding with the earlier Mikulin engines.
It was to bring air in.
Yeah.
Not to drive a propeller, right?
Yeah. On the TB3, there was one that was designed to drive a propeller as well. But then when things moved on to the Soviet Union's next big bomber, the Petlikov PE-8, it was used as an auxiliary engine for the for the other four.
And do I remember that correctly? But when they tried that, the design team was locked up in prison, and they had no one to build it, and they couldn't make it work, so they discarded it. Was that
Yes,
not them?
Yeah. So basically, half the design team was in the gulag by year 2 of the development phase, which isn't really ideal when you're trying to design a strategic bomber for your air force. It's not good when the designing people are in prison, especially the ones that are in charge of maintaining a complex schedule for building the power plant system. But that happened. They abandoned it because it was plagued by reliability difficulties, and also they were experimenting with switching over the whole design, and they did, like, many of them were built with these engines. They switched the whole thing over to diesel engines,
Yes.
which had better reliability, gave it better range at the cost, obviously, of overall performance. But it gave it better. It was a bit heavier, yes. Not by much, though. But those diesel ones had the better range, and they were the ones that were used for the really long-range missions when the PE-8 was used in that capacity, which wasn't often, mostly because, if they're... By that point, the Germans are already dealing with the strategic bombing campaign of the Allies, and so every major bombing target was beginning to bristle with anti-aircraft defenses. And so the few PE-8s that were being sent over longer range strategic targets were taking quite severe losses, either from intercepting aircraft or from static anti-aircraft defenses.
But when we talk about the Russians and then you say diesel engine aircraft, exactly what I mean. Like, yes, we take B-34, we put wings on, it'll fly, no problem, comrade.
Yes.
Is there any Western Air Force ever that had a diesel-powered plane?
So the Germans actually made use of it specifically with their the flying boats, the flying clog, the BV, the Blumenvoss BV.
Oh, I love those.
1-3, I think it was like the 139, 136. You see, we were talking about memory earlier on. It's like I did a video on this plane 2 years ago, and I have probably forgotten 80% about it now because I've done research for other things.
Exactly. But we reset for every episode. We reset.
But they went with that. They went with that setup because it could be refueled by U-boats at sea.
Brilliant.
Because it ran on the same fuel. So, for the Germans, the choice of diesel was done for a logistical reason, and other aircraft made use of diesel-powered Junkers engines as well.
Okay,
it had benefits. Like there are benefits for using diesel engines. The range, the refuelability for flying boats at sea, but the reason why most aircraft at the time used, traditional gasoline petrol engines was power.
Jet fuel,
air
fuel.
Aviation fuel. Aviation fuel is good at what it does. It's very difficult to take diesel and improve it and improve it for aviation use whilst it's still being diesel and having the benefits of being diesel. If you improve diesel, it isn't diesel anymore. You
refine it a little more. You eventually get to something else.
Exactly.
But was that also part of Russian at that time capabilities of mass production of aviation fuel or finer fuels, or did they? I mean, when I think Russian, I don't think finesse.
No, it wasn't a case of that because they were already at that point beginning to crank out conventional fighter aircraft and strike aircraft in frightening numbers towards the end of the 30s, and they were running on traditional aviation fuel that the Soviets were able to produce. So it wasn't a case of that. It was more so they were exploring options to get around the range and the reliability problem, because with single engine aircraft they were doing okay, but they were struggling to produce good, reliable, long-lasting engines for their multi-engine bombers. for some reason they really struggled with the bigger bombers. Like with the smaller ones, like the SB, the Air 2, that sort of thing, they were on the whole pretty okay. But the diesel engine was used primarily on their heavier, longer range stuff in a quasi-experimental role. Sometimes they were done on mainline production variants, like on the PE8. But I think they eventually came to the same conclusion that everyone else did, and that was just ab fuel was the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, so whatever happened to the Russian bomber program? Did it ever? What did they end up having? What did they end up having in 41?
So in 41, they had a lot of TB3s still. Now, those were employed as bombers. They were also employed along with the older TB1 as airborne troop carriers. There is some really good footage of them being used as airborne trainers, and you can see poor Vasily getting onto the wing, and they're like, comrade, just slide off the back of the plane as it's flying along, the Russian wilderness, and it's like, this is the world's most dangerous slippy slide, and I'm so here for it. It's like it's honestly very comical, but it worked, and some TB3s were also at this point being used to test the concept of Parasite fighters with the TB3 acting as the mothership. And there's a couple of photos you can find of a TB3 with 5 planes bolted onto it, and it carries them along. And these were actually used in combat, and their effectiveness was proven. I've literally got a book down there called Vagmistrov's Circus, which covers the topic of the Zvino Parasite fighter. And so they were employed. Like the bulk of the TB3s weren't used for that, but some were.
So was that in order to infiltrate deep into enemy territory and then let the fighters go far from bases, or to conserve on their fuel?
It does depend on where you're getting your sources from, because there's a bit of funnily enough, there's a bit of conflicting information when it comes to these strange Russian experiments just before World War II. I know, right? Very shocking. It was done as a way to extend the range of like lighter strike aircraft. Mm-hmm. It was also done as some consider it as an experiment of finding a better way to also protect bombing aircraft, which is something that was then done in the early Cold War with the United States Air Force, with the wingtip and Project Phycon stuff, because at the start of the Cold War, strategic bombers had insanely good range, but their escort fighters did not. So they were, let's just stick the fighter to the plane and carry it along for the ride. If we come under attack, the fighter detaches and blows stuff up, comes back, reattaches in mid-flight. What could possibly go wrong?
Really?
Yeah. So there are some amazing photos of like B-36s with either fighters under its belly or flying along physically attached to the wingtips. Like you've got 2 F-84s on each side of the B-36 just cruising along at 30,000 feet. Like physically attached to the wingtips, and then they just attach when they need to go and do their thing. Which is,
I'm assuming you're doing a video on those at some point.
Yes,
I definitely would.
but they were inspired. From reports of these earlier experiments that the Russians did in the late 30s and during the war as well, where the TB3 was used.
I mean, the Zeppelins would carry along small fighter planes with them for a while as well.
Yeah. So the US experimented with that as well. There's some great archive footage of I think there were Curtiss Hawks, which had been modified to be carried by airships as self-defense fighters. But after the loss of I think it was the USS Archon, the airship the Navy airship that spectacularly crashed, that they just binned the whole concept after that. It didn't crash because of the Parasite fighters. It crashed for some other reason, but that kind of killed any enthusiasm for military airships.
I mean, things crash. The Zeppelin didn't do that.
No, but going back to the Soviet Air Force, by the start of war with Germany, their main heavy bomber that was being fielded was still the TB3, which by that point was already looking a little long in the tooth if you compare it to, you know, the sleek lines of something like the admittedly slightly smaller Heinkel HE-111, but, you know, one of those looks a lot more modern than the other. You know, the TB3 still has these giant fixed axle like undercarriages. You know, it's got men that are sitting in dustbins suspended from the wing. It's made from pig iron. You know, it's this sort of very industrial sort of diesel punk flying machine.
Some of the Russian early stuff was very diesel cyberpunk, really.
And for they were used, but they weren't used in the same sort of numbers that other Soviet planes were used following the following Barbarossa. You know, some like you know a heap were destroyed on the ground. Of a heap of Russian planes were destroyed on the ground in the opening days. Some of those were TB3s, but quite a few were not, because being long range aircraft, they were staged a bit further back. So they sort of suffered. They suffered less during that. And following that, they were employed in the offensive role, but a lot of them were actually used for logistics, transportation. They continued to consider the idea of using them as airborne transports, but as far as I'm aware, they weren't used in that role against the Germans.
Russia had somewhere between 1 and 2, depending on sources. That's it usually. Somewhere between 1 and 2. They said themselves they had 2 million paratroopers. Which is traditionally also not something you have for a defensive war.
No.
Defensive paratroopers are not really a thing.
And it's interesting because, like, they say they had that many, and it's like, okay, but where are the transport? These poor TB3s are going to be doing like return trips, like five times a day, just to get them. They didn't
build that many of them, did they?
No. There was only a few hundred.
Yeah,
like the same with the PE8s, because, you know, again, very quickly. I mean, even before war broke out between the Soviet Union and Germany, things were already shifting, like from a doctrinal perspective, to the tactical warfare aspect of employing bombing aircraft and larger aircraft. You know, there's a reason why most multi-engine aircraft operated by the Russians during the Second World War were twin-engine aircraft at most.
So not much different than what the Germans, really.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like you had your Tupolev SBs, which is sort of I guess you could call it the equivalent of the earlier Dornier Do-17s, and then they had, you know, things like the PE2, which was probably one of the best aircraft they fielded during the whole war, alongside the IL-2 and its later derivatives.
Yeah.
I mean, if you could pick a single non-fighter aircraft operated by the Soviet Union during the Second World War, the IL-2's got to take the cake. Without question.
I'm pretty sure everyone in Russia would agree with that.
It's just, yeah.
Did they have a ground attack aircraft now that sort of built in that vein? From what I understand, it's tough, it's rugged, it's armored all the way around, and I don't remember if it's built by Ilyushin. Ilyushin still exists, right?
I think so. A lot of people might learn this today thanks to this video, but my knowledge on things after about 1975 equates to probably about this much.
That's what I always said. I still go to Europe and use maps from 1945, which always pisses off the Poles when I say I'm going to Danzig.
But like, if the footage isn't in black and white, the chances are I don't know much about it because it's too new for me.
Agreed.
Was
it Mikoyan or Ilyushin? That one of them was actually designing a plane from prison I could also be one of the other guys.
I think that was pretty much every Russian manufacturer during Second World War. A lot of them were in some sort of state of incarceration. Let's call it that.
And that caused a very interesting situation. With I remember, and I actually remember you did a video about the that Russian fighter. They needed something to replace the 16, and they had this novice, shall we say, start building or designing this fighter that completely didn't work, and he was
the Yak 4, the twin engine one, the heavier, the heavy fighter,
single engine fighter, and it was short and stubby, and he was one of Stalin's friends' son or something that had just graduated from the design bureau. That you remember the one?
I'm going to quickly open up my YouTube channel. This is how bad my memory is. It's like, oh no, what have I done?
It was so badly designed that when it sat up, he had to cut off the tips of the propellers because they were hitting the ground when it actually stood up to take off.
Oh yeah, no, I think that was the it was the Yak 2. It was a twin engine. I'm pretty certain it was the Yak 2.
Now the one I'm talking about, it is a single engine fighter.
Oh, it is.
It never became a plane. It flew once or twice, and then they parked it in a museum as how to not design a plane, and then they pulled somebody out of prison and built another one.
Oh, that might be the thing that they developed before the Yak 1.
That sounds more, yeah.
Yeah, because the Yak 3 was a good fighter, but the things that came before it were a black comedy of disastrous problems. The same could also be said for the Lag 3, which was nicknamed by some fighter pilots as the varnished coffin. In its earlier years. I have a soft spot for that plane because I think it looks quite nice, but a lot of the pilots did not have a soft spot for it when they flew it out.
Well, I mean, when they hurled towards ground in it, they became the soft spot.
Yes, exactly. You were the crumple zone.
Yes, it's lovely. So what lessons did the Russians learn in Finland? Besides that the Finns are pig-headed and just as stubborn as they are.
I think the two biggest lessons that they learned, well, maybe three, and this can be seen later on when they were fighting with the Germans, was that a lot of the fighting was done at lower altitudes. Which is different than what we see in a lot of the fighting over Western Europe later on, because a lot of that was obviously done in support of the Allied bombing efforts. So everything was a lot higher up. There was no land war to really fight over at the time. Things changed a little bit after the Normandy invasion, but they, at the start of the war against Finland, combat very quickly became lower altitude. This was partly because, again, it was a tactical war where you were supporting the army, but also some of the aircraft fielded by the Finns were much better at lower altitude than at higher altitude. And to be fair, the same was also the case for the Russian ones. Another thing that was a painful lesson for both sides, which is funny, funny in a dark, humorous kind of way, was it's one thing to do training, war games, practicing and stuff for the elements. It is a very different matter to actually fight a war in the elements, particularly this nasty thing called winter, which is something that both sides learned very painful lessons in. They also learned that it's probably a good idea when you declare war in a country where there's going to be a lot of fighting in snow, it's probably smart to actually have winter gear for your troops before you start sending them in, so that they don't have to stuff, newspaper and bark into their trousers.
And Germans were also looking at you on that one.
Yeah, exactly. But this also extended to the Air Force as well. maintenance was a problem for several reasons, not just because the ice and the cold made, lubricants and everything a nightmare to deal with, but the ground crews were literally freezing to death because, if there wasn't enough winter gear for the soldiers on the front, what the hell were the people behind the front line going to be wearing when they were out in these big open hangars? Because, they didn't have heating or anything like that in these remote airstrips. Everything, if you weren't fixing the plane, you were in some sort of shack with a small fire or something burning, or a log burner, or maybe a oil stove if you were lucky. But that was it. And maintaining aircraft in those conditions is incredibly difficult because of the effect that it has on the people that are physically doing the work.
It's interesting because then somewhere between fighting the Japanese in the heat and summer of the steppe and fighting the Finnish in the cold and snow would really give the Russians a very good base knowledge of how it is to fight in adverse conditions.
Yes,
and all different conditions.
Yeah,
that has been very good lessons learned from both.
Yeah, and you can really see that because when you start when you get into the war between Russia and Germany, particularly sort of post turning point, post Stalingrad, the way that their airfields operate is significantly different. The way that planes are stored and maintained, the way that the ground crews are housed, equipped, is vastly different than what you saw with things when they were fighting the Finns just a few years earlier. Like it's night and day. There aren't that many photos that exist of what the ground conditions were like during the war against Finland, but there are some, and it looks like these photos are 10 years separated between what you see fighting the Finns and then what you see fighting the Germans just a few years later in some of these. And the biggest thing that I would say that was an improvement from the lessons learned fighting the Finns versus when they got to fighting the Germans was having a effective structure of command, funnily enough.
Oh, that thing.
Yeah, that thing, the thing that got violently purged in the late 30s and then sort of had to rebuild itself in a hurry.
Oh, killing off all your smart people is not a good idea.
No. You cannot overnight a good officer make, as they say. It takes time. And, the VVS was not in a good way when things kicked off with Finland. The structure was disorganized. They were in the process of trying to re-equip with all sorts of different aircraft, some of which were designed for multiple roles that they weren't really good at anything. And there was also a manpower issue with some of the squadrons. Like some of the squadrons were just under equipped. Like hilariously, they had the planes, they just didn't have the people to fly or maintain.
I mean, you can take any peasant and teach him how to shoot a rifle and charge towards a German line. Having to understand the flight and that whole aerodynamics, it actually takes training. Imagine
training and reinforcement as well. Like, it's it does get to a point where you get muscle memory, but it's like, if you want this pilot to do well and you want them to survive their first aerial engagement, you've got to give them more than just say a basic 8-hour training session. They got to get hours on their logbook. They've got to learn how the thing operates. They've got to learn if something goes wrong mechanically whilst they're out in the middle of a flight, what can they do to bring the plane back home? And if not, how do you safely ditch or bail out, etc.
Did they have parachutes? They didn't have parachutes, all of them, did they?
No, not all of them did. Same thing with the Japanese pilots, because especially with them, it was do or die. So they're like, why am I bringing a parachute?
A little bit like the British didn't want to issue parachutes to theirs in World War I because it might give them the idea to abandon a perfectly good aircraft while on fire.
Yeah, and at the time during World War I, the Germans didn't have parachutes.
Exactly.
So but
for the Finnish campaign, for any air force, it was a few months of fighting. For any air force to lose 1,000 planes,
Yep.
That it must. I guess we're back to a quantity have a quality of its own. And I always think that that's the things that they always forget about the Russians when they say, well, they lost the Finnish campaign basically, and they had to settle for a victory. But it's not entirely true, because they got what they wanted. They force-fed people and more people and more people the traditional Russian way. We are going to feed people into this Ukraine until the job is done. And if they come home in boxes, we'll find more people, even if we have to find them in Korea. And that was sort of, plus the Russians did this in Arctic temperatures. They launched hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, thousands of planes in Arctic temperatures, in snow and winter. And they still, a lot of them died. And the Finnish did a hell of a job, but the Russians still won. They got what they wanted, and they had to. That's what a lot of people they don't look at when they look at specifically the Finnish campaign, is that Stalin had a problem, was that the Allies were starting to look at him as the aggressor. It was a terrible thing. They were actually starting
good for optics.
I know, like poor Stalin. They're turning on him just because you attacked exactly the same amount of countries that the Germans did. But when he was starting, the British and the Americans were withdrawing war aid. They were starting to send planes to Finland. And they were even talking about bombing the Russian oil fields in Palestine and the others. So Stalin was starting to see, if he doesn't stop this, he wasn't ready for war with everybody. And ideally, the plan was always for the Western powers to fight themselves to an exhaustion, so he can just roll up all of Europe. That pretty much sums up what his plan was. But he wasn't ready at that point. So he sort of had to wrap up Finland and get this thing ended, because there was a lot of diplomacy going awry against him from the Americans, from the English at that time, which was also a factor into why he stopped when he did. So it wasn't just black and white. The Finns fought him to a standstill. And that was actually...
sorry.
That was part of it. So when we get to World War II, when we get to beginning of 1941, what does the Russians have? What are they focused on? Smaller
equipment wise?
What kind of planes? What are the
they had a lot of their sort of interwar fighter planes still, notably the Polikarpov I-16 biplane and the I-16 monoplane fighters. Obviously, the I-16s were the preferred of the two, but the aforementioned one was built in a lot of numbers as well, so they were obviously on inventory. They had the TB3, as mentioned before, and they also had the SB2, which was very popular. It was used during Spain. It was used during Kalkengol. Comparable to, say, like, the Dornier 17 or, a light to medium twin engine British or American bomber. And that could be used. They built thousands of those. And, the production run was well and truly, in swing by the time things kicked off with the Germans. And those were used, although we know them most famously for being used for, like, more low altitude tactical raids, they were also employed for, like, more medium level strategic bombing, I suppose you could call it. They were used in that way in the campaign against Japan, because they realized that a lot of the Japanese aircraft had not the best climb rates in the world and not the highest ceilings, and so they were like, okay, well, the Tupolev SB is fast, it can go to relatively high altitude, let's just bomb them from above. It had the accuracy of a blind mouse at that altitude, but at least it was safe. Which is
bombing.
Exactly, which is one of the things that sort of shifted Soviet focus. But so when things kicked off, you had a a relatively still outdated Air Force. Like, there were more modern aircraft that were in development, like the Yak-1, which turned into the Yak-3, your MiGs, and your Lag-3. And in terms of strike aircraft, the IL-2 Sturmovik.
Yes.
But they weren't really available in sufficient numbers. I think by the time of hostilities, there were a couple of hundred IL-2s. Don't quote me on that, YouTube, please. Thank you. They didn't correct us. Someone is furiously typing an exact number, and I thank you in advance for that.
Exactly.
But the bulk, the bulk of the Air Force was pretty outdated. But what they lacked in tech, they made up for in numbers. But it was nothing compared to the ground situation, where the Soviets had an insane amount of men, tanks, vehicles, and that the Air Force at the Soviet Air Force at the start of the war compared to the end of the war, like any, was starkly different.
Yeah.
But it didn't have the same insane numbers that you saw on the ground, partly because of production issues, like how we said, half the design teams were in the gulags and everything. And also partly due to the poor structure of the VVS, which made it difficult to essentially set out things like your specification and your requirements for what planes you wanted, because half the Air Force wanted to go for one doctrine, half the Air Force wanted to go for another, and a third was in prison.
Yeah, well, that's going to be a problem again for communication.
Yeah.
So of the planes that they had built. And it's interesting again when we look at the numbers for the 1941 Russian Air Force is between 10 and 15,000.
Yeah,
like so that only makes up more planes than most other militaries had combined. 5,000 planes, more or less.
Yes.
Love that. So it's been said that, well, all the obsolete planes were destroyed in the initial stages of Barbarossa, which doesn't sound entirely wrong.
No.
But so did they. Was that almost like a cleansing? So now they could rebuild the newer models, or did some of the old models continue?
Some of the old models continued. Like they had a lot of the I-16s, and yes, a lot were destroyed in the opening stages, but a lot were still used for a considerable period of time. And the I-16 was outdated compared to newer fighters like the, BF-109 or ME-109, whatever your preference is. Specifically, it lacked the protection that newer aircraft offered, like, your armored seats, your bulletproof glass in the front of the canopy.
Yeah.
There is a bit of a myth that the I-16 was underarmed compared to its German rivals, but by this stage, a lot of the I-16s that were being fielded were the later cannon-armed models. There were still some machine gun-only armed models, but in terms of just pure firepower and burst mass of what was being sent downrange when you pulled the trigger, it was more or less equal to, like, your earlier cannon-armed BF-109E series, for example. Quite comparable. The 109E was definitely a lot more accurate with its guns because everything was mounted along the center line, whereas the I-16 had centerline guns and also wing-mounted guns. So you have things like dispersion, convergence, all that to worry about. Yeah. The Soviets were fielding more advanced monoplane fighters by this point, but what they were just because I know the history of these two planes, what they were fielding were things like the abortive Yak-1, which turned into the Yak-3, and they were also fielding the Lag-3, which is the one that sort of gets covered, I suppose, a bit more and has copped more flack of the two. The Lag-3 was introduced in early 41, and it was constructed primarily from laminated wood as opposed to metal, to conserve strategic materials for other planes, which is fair enough, although weirdly, building the plane out of wood made it heavier, and there were issues with the power plant, so it was also woefully underpowered as well. So the Lag 3 was a flammable, slow, unreliable fighter that was sluggish in the turns. It didn't have the best climb rate. And it was also prone to entering spins, unrecoverable spins, during sharp maneuvers. And that didn't give the Russian pilots time to bail out, because a lot of the time, these aerial engagements against German fighters were happening, 2,000 meters or below. That is not a lot of space between you and terra firma to bail out.
No, not at all.
And when you're spinning, you're fighting against centrifugal force. You're trying to get the canopy open. You've still got the German plane flying around trying to shoot you whilst you're spinning out of control half the time. It's a stressful situation. So that didn't make the Lags particularly popular.
But it could absorb a lot of damage because of the wood. Was that not the case? It was fairly.
It was, and it wasn't. It all depends on where the bullets landed. Like the physical structure was pretty good. The issue was that if the like with the Japanese planes, if the fuel tank was hit, that was sort of curtains. Because laminated wood is, depending on what you use for the laminated wood can be incredibly flammable. It was, the airframe itself was remarkably sturdy when you're not shooting at it. So there are a lot of photos of Lag 3s that have been downed, either due to engine failure or battle damage, and they've survived wheels up landings in the Russian wilderness, and overall the airframe is actually in pretty good condition. So from a blunt force trauma perspective, you could say the Lag 3 was pretty good. Just don't set it on fire.
It's a great plane, great war plane, just don't shoot it.
Yeah, basically. And its development eventually led to a lot of things that evolved into the much better Lavochkin LA5, because the early issues with its inline engines led to testing with the M82, and let me just check my note. Yes, the M82 radial, which was then put into the Lavochkin planes, which were beloved by pilots for their handling, their proclivity to not catch fire, and their good performance versus the Germans. That was one of the first planes that sort of saw the Soviet pilots really get parity and then superiority over
was that the
Axis.
First one all metal production?
That and the Yak, I believe.
There were some of the planes that was still both wood and metal.
Yes, so some of the early Yakovlevs were mixed construction at the time. That was partly for the same reason, for the Lag, to conserve strategic materials, and it was also from a time and technological constraint where they just needed to get these things out. They were still working on perfecting the art of developing, semi-monocoque stress metal skins, that sort of thing. So they're like, right, no, wood. we need the plane built.
And plus, you probably have a lot of carpenters in that time of Russia.
Mm-hmm.
People are good at
a lot of furniture makers.
Wood more so than metal. Metal was relatively new.
Yep, and Russia has a lot of trees.
It does.
A lot of trees.
A lot of trees.
there's going to be no supply issue when it comes to that. You probably run out of people before you run out of trees.
Yes, and there's a lot of mosquitoes in those Eastern Europe trees there.
Yes,
I can tell you. So a lot of the technology that initially laid the foundation for this, from what I understand, a lot of American companies, metallurgy, engines, production, came from America, was traded for gold and grain and a lot of gold, actually. How big an influence did, basically it sounded to me like in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, a lot of American tech went to Russia that they then developed from. Is that also British, I think?
Yeah, so a lot, and this this applies to a couple of countries, not just Russia, but Russia is a good example, because a lot of people will say, the Russian Air Force only got really good because they stole all the tech from the Americans, the Allies, and that sort of thing. But the thing is, when you're looking at it from their perspective, and the same applies to Japan and the same applies to China as well. These are countries that, for different reasons, were lagging behind a little bit when it came to aviation technology, either due to massive civil unrest or civil war, or the fact that they were a smaller nation and they just arrived late to the party.
Yes.
If you're trying to build an effective modern air industry, and if other people are willingly offering you to let you use some of their tech, you'd be insane to leave that offer sitting on the table. Yes. Like you're gonna take it. Like, if you see a nation that's got this amazing aircraft industry, they're producing all sorts of wonderful machines with reliable engines, like the Douglas DC-3, for example. Of
Yes.
course you're gonna want to build that. And so a lot of the technology that was traded, exchanged, bribed, depending on what we're talking about here, false promises, etc. It definitely had a big impact. Like a lot of the early era engines used in the Soviet Union. There is a book actually here. Let me very quickly get it. That sounded like my headphones falling on the floor. It was. This is one of the most niche books you could probably get, but Russian piston era engines.
Okay.
Of course. Try and find it secondhand, because if you try to just buy it on Amazon, it will cost you a small fortune.
Yes, I noticed books are getting more and more expensive.
Oh, but a lot of it's like the first third of the book. It's like an engine with a Russian name, and then it's followed by, this is a license built version of the Bristol Jupiter, or the Wright Cyclone or something. It's like, the first third of Russian era engine history prior to World War II is all license built stuff, because they didn't have the industry or the design knowledge to build their own. So of course they're going to use stuff that's already working.
Yeah, I mean, and eventually the Germans and copying that.
Exactly. And they obviously eventually developed their own to their own needs and requirements. But it did have big influences, and I think the biggest influence that American aviation technology probably would have on Russian aviation technology, especially during the Second World War, was the emphasis on reliance with radial engines, which is funny because if you look at the Russian Air Force during the Second World War, it's about a 50-50 split between inline and radials when you look at the different planes that they fielded. Whereas, in the States, I would say, the radial engine definitely dominated in terms of, you got most things that were carrier fielded were radial engines. Most of the bombers were radial engined. The inline engines were mostly for your fighters, like your P-51 Mustang. But even then, the majority of them were radial engines. P-47, the Bearcat, F-4F Wildcat. The list goes on. But of the Russian fighter planes, the ones that appear to be consistently the most popular with pilots were, funnily enough, the radial engine ones, because they got you home. They could take a lot more battle damage. You don't have to worry about liquid cooling. Air-cooled engines can take an absolute flogging and still keep going, so long as they don't have super complex turbo supercharging mechanisms. Look at you, P-47.
I mean, anytime you have technology that involves life and death, and you use the terminology super technical, anything.
Yeah. And you see that as well, because like with later on with the and they keep borrowing tech, or borrowing air quotes. Look at the Tupolev. What was it? The Tu-4, the Soviet B-29. It's like, what's this? You've accidentally crash landed one of your strategic nuclear bombers. Yes, we will look after it for you. We definitely won't copy every square inch of its design and reverse engineer it.
They were lucky. They didn't even crash land it. They had the three that emergency landed, that came over Japan and then landed Russian air bases.
That's right. Yep. It's like, oh, look, free bomber.
The DC-3 was built under license.
Yeah. And the what was there was the DC-3 was built under license, and and post-war, jet engines. Yes, no, we promise we will use your Rolls-Royce engines for civilian purposes only. We're definitely not going to take them and bolt them onto a World War II fighter aircraft to see if we can make a bootleg jet fight.
Or I mean that goes all the way up to the Konkordsky.
Yeah. Oh, there were some great videos.
It's complete coincidence. It ended up looking exactly like a
cardboard. No. I would do a video on that, but I think honestly there are that many really good videos on it already that I would just be wasting my breath. Like, I love Konkordsky. I love it, but like there are some really good docos on it now. But yeah, like it's to answer your initial question, they would be stupid to not use the Western technology that was being either offered to them, or they would be stupid also to not try and steal it, because they were behind. They were behind in the technological game, and at the end of the day, if you can't get it via normal means, nick it.
I mean, they're communists. It's kind of part of the game. It's like,
and also, like, we're talking about a time period as well, like, where people were going to war all the time. I mean, with the exception of the past few years, I grew up in a time of insanely relative peace compared to the history of Europe for the past 2,000 years. When it comes to tech, the next war is always around the corner, so you had to maintain that advantage. And use the best that you can find.
Of course, one way or another. So they put a focus on tactical aircraft, a tactical campaign, not a strategic campaign as such.
Yeah.
Did that continue? That was the general intent. I mean, the whole ideology of communism is to forcibly spread. Yeah. So that ideology would be infused into the armed forces to create offensive weapons, to spread, to share, to attack. That was the mentality. I don't know if there's a parallel there, but I think there's a parallel, but I don't know if there's a deliberate parallel there.
Yeah.
So after the war began, it was the same mindset. I'm assuming they didn't start building any kind of specifically dedicated defensive aircraft because they were planning on eventually turning the war around, which they did.
Yeah.
Were they continuing to make the same type of tactical aircraft after 41?
Yes. So basically, when the war kicked off, one of the main things that you just said that really hurt the Soviet Air Force was the complete lack of a defensive focus in the VVS. It was an offensive air force first and foremost. Like, there were fighters that were kept in sort of further back stations, sort of in the interceptor role. But they were not designed as an interceptor in any way. They were just right. This squadron is for intercepting. This squadron is for attacking. But the planes are exactly the same. Like, they don't have like these ones don't have extra long range, even though they're further back. They don't have better climb rates, even though they're meant to be hunting bombers. We're just going to shoot you if you don't do your mission correctly.
Did the pilots have different training?
Possibly. That's actually a really good question. But mind you, in 1941, the average pilot was not particularly well trained because, as you were getting this really sort of build up of the Russian forces, following Poland between 39 and 41, the size of the VVS exploded. You went from having a couple of thousand aircraft on strength to 10,000 aircraft on strength. They just did not have the time or the resources to train all those pilots. So I imagine the training would be pretty uniform and pretty scant. But yeah, during the war, the tactical focus was maintained. The tactical aircraft would be supporting the army. The fighters were there to provide air cover. They were used in the interceptor role when needed, but honestly, for most of the fighting, most bombing was concentrated more so on the front lines rather than going behind the enemy lines and bombing cities and stuff. If you were bombing things behind enemy lines, it was things like rear staging points, larger supply depots, railway stations, key infrastructural nexuses.
Yes.
Which was what the small fleet of PE-8s, the long-range bombers, were used for mostly, was to strike those important industrial or infrastructure targets that couldn't be reached by other aircraft.
Yeah, because we don't think of the Second World War Red Air Force as doing strategic heavy bombing of German cities, that was all the British and the Americans.
Yeah,
that never really seemed to be it.
Yeah, no, it was just also, I mean, the thing that also dictated it obviously was geography. You know, the Allies were staging their air forces from Britain. There was no army to support until the invasion of Normandy, thanks to that puddle that's called the English Channel. And whereas on the Eastern Front, you had, what was it, 2,500 miles of front line, I think, or something like that.
Yeah,
I'm trying to convert it from the kilometer number to miles, but it's a very large front with millions of soldiers. The Air Force was going to be busy enough just supporting that huge front than to worry about doing a strategic bombing campaign.
Yeah,
and that was always going to be that case. Like, even before the war, the Soviets knew that it's going to, the First World War was evidence enough. It's going to be a land war. There's nothing, there's no body of water separating them. It's going to be hard fighting in the mud, in the snow, in the summer heat with the mosquitoes. The planes have to support the troops.
And the Russians always have more men than they have planes, so it's easier to have the men run forward.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Some things really never change, do they? Over there.
Yes.
I remember lecturing at the academy on Russian Cold War tactics, which was basically the same 3 lines of soldiers that would attack the first row fully armed and geared up, and the next leg they would pick up the weapons from the dead, and the third they would have nothing, pick up from the dead, and continue forward. Massed arm attacks, mass helicopter attacks, casualty heavy, whatever. There's enough of us. We'll get there. And it's a very interesting way of waging war when, we'll just keep marching people forward until the enemy runs out of bullets.
Yep.
It's not very people friendly, is it?
No. But it credit where credit's due. It worked. Eventually, after they expended a lot of men and resources, it technically worked.
So did pilot training get better during the war? I assume it did.
Pilot training got better. Again, I don't sources are a little bit limited in terms of, there are a lot of really good writings on the Soviet Air Force and BVS. But if you're looking at writings that are in English, a lot of them are by, Yefim Gordon, for example, which is great. But it does make it a little bit difficult if you sort of want to cross-reference with other things to make sure the numbers you're reading are actually the numbers you should be telling people about on the internet. Because we know the internet is the forum of all things truthful. But no, the training got better, but it never reached the same level of, I think sophistication is the wrong word. The way that air training was done a little bit differently compared to how it was done, say, with the US Army Air Force, in terms of hours logged, competency assessment, gunnery training, that sort of thing. And a lot of it was due to the fact that they were just, like you said, just sending them in as quickly as they could. So I would say, on average, your Soviet pilot was always a little bit less trained than the better Allied pilots. But on the other hand of things, a lot of Allied pilots also going in undertrained as well. The training was definitely better than at the start. It wasn't perfect.
I mean, the Allies also had the ability of they had enough fuel and everything. Hang on, let me just kill this light. For some reason, I seem to be lit here. The Allies also had the luxury of having enough fuel to train pilots before sending them to theater.
Yeah.
But when you got to Barbarossa, you had the best trained pilots with combat experience were the Germans, because they had aces going for them all along.
Yeah.
And the least probably trained Russian pilots at the same time. So the first, I'm assuming the first year and a half, 2 years was a rather mismatched air battle until the Russian pilots caught up and the good ones survived and started becoming aces.
Yes,
I'm assuming it's the same in the air as I see on the ground.
And the good ones that were surviving and becoming good pilots were sort of playing a game of back and forth, because some were being kept on the front lines because they were good, and some were being pulled back because they're like, hey, you're good. Can you train these guys, which don't know anything?
Yeah.
And you find that a lot with all the air forces in the Second World War. It gets to the point where you get some of these really, really good pilots who want to keep flying on the front lines. And the Air Force goes, no, you're training instead. And, and some of them go against orders and somehow find interesting and inventive ways of getting back to frontline squadrons and fighting again, which is some interesting stories for another day. But
which seems to be actually repeated on all sides, because all sides seem to have. I mean, was it Heydrich that kept running away and getting shot down, and everybody sort of did this? Had the cowboy that would go do something.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I think the part of the Soviet Air Force that received the most effort, training word. I'm trying to think of a word that sort of attention. There we go. Thank you. Was definitely the units that were in the ground support strike role. So your IL-2s and all of that. They obviously got a fair amount of training because rockets, because a lot of them were using the anti-tank rocket. I forget what the exact designation was, but you either had the high explosive or you had the heat round.
They had heat rounds in the rocket.
Yes, I believe some of them. I believe some of them had the heat rockets, although I could be getting that mixed up with what the Allies had, because the Allies were definitely experimenting with heat.
Well, the Germans had them too. Had a bunch of Panzerfaust-like things stuck on too.
Yes, and they also had the anti-bombing rockets as well, the Waffengranate 21 centimeter big boys.
Yeah,
which were very scary. But I think it would probably be a safe thing to say one of the hardest things about being a strike pilot, aside from surviving, although you're in a flying tank, so you're pretty good, is getting consistently accurate with your attacks.
Yes.
And a lot of that comes down to just having balls of steel, because obviously the closer you are to the enemy tank with your cannons or your rockets, the lower the chance of you missing is going to be.
Yes.
Just don't accidentally land on the Tiger tank. We don't want you to do that. But there's some really interesting gun camera footage of ground attacks in Western Europe following the Normandy invasion that showed just how close to the ground and how close to the vehicles that some of these were getting. And there's some really good footage, which might be a bit more comparable, of the Vickers cannon armed Hawker Hurricanes. They had the big 40mm Vickers guns under the wings, fighting in Africa. And there's some gun camera footage you can find on the Imperial War Museum website. And it's 10, 20 feet from the deck. And basically just zooming over the roofs of the supply trucks and the tanks in the desert and waiting until the absolute last second to squeeze off those cannon rounds. The Soviets weren't exactly using the exact same technology, but the biggest challenge was not keeping the pilots alive. It was keeping them useful.
Yeah. Well, they are more useful when they're alive.
But useful from a destruction of enemy assets standpoint, I suppose.
I mean, what was one of the rumors I heard, that Russian pilots in the early war year in 41 would take off, and regardless if they found anything or not, they would drop their bombs because they were afraid to come back with them.
Mm-hmm.
They were still an early politicized control.
Yeah.
which eventually ceased. Stalin eventually rescinded that and let the military actually run the military.
Yeah, and remarkably, things got a lot better.
Have the professional
surprise, surprise. It's like, oh, well, let's let the experts be the experts. What do you mean it's working? What is this?
Goering, take note. Shut up.
Yes.
I feel it's interesting. I studied Hermann Goering and his life, and he's an interesting figure because at the point he went through so much hardship from 20 after the putsch for 10 years. They were broke. They had nothing. He was madly in love with his Swedish wife. They had to sell her furs for food. He got addicted to drugs. They had horrible life. He was committed to get off drugs. They had to beg for money and just to survive. And finally, they get into the party. In 33, he gets in his office and he finally gets the big job and Lufthansa, and everybody's giving him money, and he can finally buy her the apartment she always wanted, buy their car back, bought their old furniture back, and then she dies. And it's like, it's the most, if it wasn't Hermann Goering, it would be the most tragic love story in the world. And if I could sell that to Hollywood if I put a different name on it. And then after that, it seems like he's just completely lost interest in anything after she died.
Yeah.
But he did carry back channels with the Czechs, with the Poles, with the British, all the way up to 42, because I really don't think he wanted to go to war, but he couldn't talk Hitler out of it. And he sort of got despondent and didn't take care of business at any point. He just, let's let it go. And it all became, let's go steal some art.
He also had the unfortunate opinion that if anything that flew, it belonged to him, which meant that German naval aviation was stuck in perpetual limbo during the entire war, and obviously in the years leading up to it.
The poor Graf Zeppelin that never went.
Oh, it makes me sad.
I was in Norway. There's one of the guns of the Graf Zeppelin at Oscarsburg.
Oh, really?
One of the original turret with the original guns and it was sitting there. I'm like, I don't know there's a bunch of different turrets sitting there, and I was like, Graf Zeppelin, holy shit! I actually did a little 5-minute episode on that just because. Well, here it is, and there's not a whole lot of it left anywhere. I don't think there's anything left of it. It's a round turret. You use of the hull turrets of the 10-centimeter guns.
Yeah.
The design is different than other naval guns. It's very interesting. But yeah, it was sad because it could have been. I don't know what they would have done with it. Not much.
Not much. No, it would have ended with the lines, and she was sunk by the Royal Navy.
or the Royal or Air Force or anything else.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been sunk by a fairy swordfish. I just know it. I can just see like another version of the Taranto raid, except it's the swordfish sinking the Graf Zeppelin at harbor. I could just see that happening. I mean, it would literally be that. And here, finally receiving the final plane. Oh, and here's the RAF. Yep.
It would. I mean, they would never have gotten out of harbor. They wouldn't have ever got anywhere with it.
No. But yeah, and surprisingly, the Soviets didn't have aircraft carriers during Barbarossa. I wonder why. They didn't need one. Well, and the Germans didn't really need one, let's be honest, but they built one anyway.
Well, the Soviets ended up with it anyway, and then they sunk the damn thing.
Yeah.
It was very, very unfortunate because the Germans did give them a bunch of old hulls and things. Planes and Hitler's reasoning for giving them plans of the Messerschmitt and for guns and things was, well, by the time they were going to invade them anyway, so by the time they figured out how to make it work,
we'll have something
too
better
late for them. And what was Russia at that time? Were they good at getting things through development fast and into production? Or was that I'm just sensing no on this?
No. Like the like after the war kicks off, obviously things get streamlined a lot more quickly because just necessity. but pre-war with Germany, everything is just, if you read the story of the development history of a Russian plane, it's like delay, and then the words, and then things got worse, usually followed with something.
I'm hearing constant design changes as a term.
Yes, design changes, also changes in the design team, either because someone has been imprisoned, shot, reassigned to somewhere else because of disputes. There was a lot of obviously everyone's trying to cozy up to Stalin. There's a lot of nepotism happening and that kind of thing. And people fall in and out of favor, which leads to certain projects getting shelved when they shouldn't have been, and other ones getting pushed forward when they really shouldn't been. Like the, that tailless fighter / strike aircraft concept I did a video on a couple of years ago. It looked like a half flying saucer. Hang on, what was it called?
Yeah. It didn't have vertical tail fins.
That's correct. Yeah, it was the Kalinin K-12. The development was halted when he fell out of favor, funnily enough. We're talking about the same guy that developed that giant flying monstrosity in the 1920s.
That's right.
That
the one that somebody made that really interesting.
That model about, and I did a video on it, and it was like one of my first kind of viral videos, which is the K7, that utter crazy machine.
I think that was I'm pretty sure I saw that, because how can you not? It was an amazing plane.
Yeah, but should it had ever? It was an amazing, but it should never have been attempted upon. To be, let's be real, but it's a good metaphor for the state of like Russian interwar development prioritization for a lot of things. We were going for things that were big and impressive, and not necessarily things that were going to work.
I mean, you also sometimes you just have to build something so massively, stupidly big just to see if you can, just to tell people that you did it, and then
like the Maxim Gorky, I think it was the ANT-20, like, which at the time was the world's largest fixed wing like land plane airliner. Like, technically the Dornier DOX was the biggest interwar aircraft by mass, but the Maxim Gorky was the biggest aircraft by wingspan, which was like this huge. It was a huge, like, they made two of them because the first one crashed because it was flying in formation with some smaller fighter planes, and one of the planes did like a loop around it and hit it. and it went in. So and everyone was really sad that this great Soviet aircraft was destroyed. So there was like a public fundraising sort of thing that happened, and they raised enough money to build a second one.
What was and the first one he built, that was destroyed when, was it another plane that lost an engine and fell out of the sky? Or was that something?
That's probably one of several planes. Several things lost engines and fell out the sky during those times. It wasn't a uniquely Russian problem either.
I remember I saw the video you did where we talked about this wonderful prototype, and that was destroyed because another plane had an engine fall off and hit it and destroyed it. And I thought to myself, no, can we just stop and go back up to the plane which engine fell off and tell that story?
Oh yes.
I mean, you have problems in the air when your engine just kind of fall out in mid-flight.
Exactly. Yes. But no, the VVS were hampered by just so many things, and like they going back to the original topic of like the Soviets being prepared for an offensive war. In terms of the Air Force, when things kicked off with Germany in 41, I would say on paper, you could call it prepared if you're looking from, an inventory perspective and an arms perspective, and how many bombs they had managed to stockpile and how many pilots they had in training. And if you put everything in a nice table and then compare it to the numbers the Germans were fielding, you were like, oh, okay, yeah, no, this is a pretty solid match. They actually outnumber the German Air Force, technically speaking. What do you mean they're losing? But it's it's a horrible combination of several different things that sort of go wrong, which sort of sums up the Eastern Front in a nutshell.
Yeah,
After
really.
Bob Rosser kicks off, it's an unfortunate series of events,
and then it got worse.
And then it got worse until it got better, until things turned around. And
yes, 1946 or 47.
But I would say by the end of the war, the VVS had gone through such a good transformation. Honestly, it's a metaphor for the Russian military in general. But it gone through a transformation, but it had also stuck with a lot of what it began with in terms of what doctrines it wanted to focus on moving forward. Whereas when you look at, say, the British and the American Air Forces, the doctrines they began with were not necessarily what they ended with, particularly with the old concept of, going with the strategic bombing approach of, the bomber will always get through. Stanley Baldwin famously was once quoted
won't
as
always
saying,
make it back, but it'll get through.
Yeah. And whereas the Russians had started with a tactical mindset, the Air Force is going to support the army. And it ended with a tactical mindset of the Air Force is going to support the army. And they were really only sort of forced into developing more of a strategic force because of the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Because the Americans had the B-29 as their nuclear bomber, and the Russians were like, how do we answer this? Let's steal it.
And when everything then later down the Cold War turned into missiles and rockets, it seems to me that the Russians then, to a large extent, pulled back to the tactical Air Force concept.
Yeah. They still had some strategic bombers, but, they weren't prioritizing them in the same way that they were prioritizing on things like, Frogfoots and MiG-29 fighters and that sort of thing. And the first programs to get cut, if you look at things that were getting shelved or things that were getting prioritized in the Soviet Air Force, especially in the mid to late Cold War, the first thing on the cutting block was always the strategic bombing program and that sort of thing, just because they were expensive as hell as well. Like, Mark II capable strategic bombers, I think it was the Tupolev Tu-122, I want to say, not cheap. Not cheap. And if you've got missiles, you don't need it. You don't need it.
Fast and large is usually not cheap.
No. And a huge radar signature.
That too. So was there anybody setting an overall vision for the Red Army Air Force before World War I? Did anybody have one plan, or did Stalin set the mindset, or was it just a whole lot of individual ideas?
Honestly, it's a bit of column A, a bit of column B, and a bit of column C.
I knew you were going to say that.
There was one guy, and I have completely forgotten his name. He was the commander who was sort of in charge of the. Was it like not? Title wasn't Marshal, it was some other interesting sort of name that you would see with a lot of Soviet command structures. He went through a long period of dogged persistence where he tried to keep the Air Force on the tactical approach. Stalin did his best to not always do what the Air Force wanted, because he was impressed by things that showed off the might and power of the Soviet Union, and a fleet of strategic bombers are obviously going to look a lot cooler than a fleet of IL-2s, for example. But as things moved from peacetime to wartime, everything sort of got shoehorned into the necessity is the better part of valor, and it very quickly became evident to everyone that what you're going to need is a lot of fighter aircraft to cover your strike aircraft, and you need every man, woman, and child in a factory building IL-2s, and But before war broke out, it was just, I wouldn't say a doctrinal mess, but it wasn't exactly a cohesively. It wasn't a cohesive mind. There wasn't a cohesive mindset in the Air Force, and a lot of that can be boiled down to a lack of tenured senior officers and commanders, courtesy of the purges as well.
Plus, it was a fairly new branch.
Like of the three, I think of the three, I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty certain that of the three branches, like the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, per head, the Air Force suffered the most, but I think that was only because it was also technically the smallest. It technically for a while had the smallest command structure, because people don't think of the Soviet Navy in the interwar years having a quite big command structure, but it did. Because it was, it was an older service. Yes. There was several hundred years of Russian naval history behind it, whereas the Air Force is only a couple of decades old. Still in its infancy, more or less.
Yes. Oh well, the Navy did have to rebuild after 1903. But anyway.
Yes, just a little bit.
We'll start all over again now.
Yeah.
So the Russian Air Force, it was its own entity, like the Army had its own command structure, its own command. It wasn't like the U.S. Army Air Corps. It wasn't underneath anybody else. It was its own.
No, it was more akin to what you had, with the Royal Air Force and Luftwaffe, the French Air Force, that sort of thing. It wasn't subservient.
So did they evolve with forward air controllers and communication with the ground forces, or was that a thought for the Air Force Russian Army?
With that, I will be completely honest here and say that I'm not 100% certain on that, because I will say that, like, of the various air forces that I've studied in the interwar years, my two weakest points would probably be the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, not the Navy Air Force. I've got quite a few things on that. And I would say the more complex aspect of the Soviet Air Force, mostly because most of my Russian books are on the aircraft and not how the Air Force itself was structured and operated. Because first and foremost, like, I've always been an aviation historian from the mechanical and technological side of things. That's the thing that kind of got me into it in the first place. And I'm now sort of beginning to really get into more of the sort of, I guess you could call it, the political and human aspect of it.
How did it work? Or how did they use it?
Yeah.
Kind of question.
Yeah. But I think, like with the German Air Force in the Eastern Front, a lot of the ways that it was structured and the ways that forward communications were handled evolved as the conflict escalated and changed and things ebbed and flowed. The Germans definitely came in with the edge because they had the experience from Poland, Holland, Belgium, France, the Battle of Britain, whereas the Russians did not. And obviously, a lot of the places where a lot of the forward air bases were in Russia, you were lucky if you had a phone connection. In some places, some of the airfields were in remarkably remote locales, and so you had radio and telephone was a thing, but there wasn't a huge amount of cohesion in those regions between what the army was doing and what the Air Force was doing. It was sometimes a case of, okay, right, X units are over here staving off the Germans attacking this small village. You need to go and try and blow up these two bridges. That's it. Like, that would probably be the level of communication they're getting.
And if my memory serves, I know the Russian tanks did not have radios for the longest time. What about the planes?
So the planes had, I'm pretty certain they had a fair amount of radio. Like, I know for a while, some aircraft did communicate with flags, which went about as well as you'd think.
Tanks too,
but I'm pretty certain that was all pre-war. That was all even pre-39. various radio systems were developed and used in the Air Force. I would say actually the Russians might have actually had the radio advantage with some of their aircraft. And I think some of it comes down to the operational requirement and the scale of the Air Force being spread out and the amount of square mileage that the Air Force was tasked with covering.
I'm thinking initially, if the Army didn't have radio communication, the tanks couldn't talk to each other, there's probably less of a chance they could talk to the planes.
Yeah, no. In terms of like air-to-ground communication, it wasn't good. Yeah. But for local like squadron comms and that definitely got to the point where it was on par with what you would see with the Royal Air Force, with the U.S. Army, Air Force, U.S. Navy, and everything. But it was behind, like, you know, in the nicest terms.
I mean, if you could say one thing about the Russians is they are very adaptive. They're fast learners.
Yes,
they turn around quite quickly. We even see that today. They learn and change and adapt. As a good army should. But when you start with a dictatorship, where if you say the wrong thing, you get shot. If you say the right thing, you get shot. If you say anything, you get shot. You stop saying things. Yeah,
I will say that it's just now that I'm remembering, because the memory banks are starting to fire up. Earlier on, the primary mode of communication, it wasn't flags, sorry, it was signal flares. So they used a lot of flares, and that was the thing that kicked off that memory of me. Was I was just thinking about the Lag 3s, and it just reminded me of me playing IL-2 Sturmovik in VR, because I love flying that game in VR. It's a lot of fun. And there were the Soviet Air Force had different colored signal flares that they would use for different things. And obviously, you know, very important communication tool with airfields, because you would use them to indicate, to tell the planes when to take off, when it was safe to land. And also the planes could use it to let them know if they were ready to land, if they were coming in distress, you know, if they had like engine issues or things like that. So at the beginning, that was the height of communication in some ways, was the use of flares. Now, the radio, there's a phone call that I can ignore because it's a spam caller. Radio definitely became more common after 43, I would say. It was reaching the level that the Allies were starting to see would be like 43. And like by the end of the war, the Soviet Air Force was doing, you know, coordinated and complex operations between the land and the air forces.
And I seem to remember you, the one that have actually told me that, just proving that I pay attention, that from a lot of the planes the Americans would send over, the Russian pilots would take the targeting sites, the sites, and the radios from them instead of flying the plane, because they didn't have any sites.
Yeah. There's some there were some planes that were sent over on a convoy to Russia. I think they were
some Hurricane.
I think they were Handley Page Hamptons. I think it was Handley Page Hamptons. And the flying suitcase, and they left
the ferry battles.
No, not at all. But they were left there for the Russians to use, and the Russians did use them, but they didn't use them for about 4 or 5 months, and then they just simply took the bomb sites out of the Hampton and transplanted it into I think it was SB bombers at the time that they were using, and used those to bomb because obviously, you know, the bomb sites are different depending on what kind of plane you're using. But they used those for I think for naval strike missions. They started using them in bombing the few German ships that they were able to harass, you know, in the Baltic and that.
Actual level bombing of ships?
Not level bombing. I'd say like low to medium altitude, because there was basically a site that they had on the Hamden that was basically good up to an altitude of about, I think it was 3,000 meters. I was about to say 3,000 feet, but that sounds far too low.
It does.
I'm pretty certain it's good up to an altitude of 3,000 meters. They basically, they refitted that onto the Tupolev SBs in 1942.
Ah.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess we didn't send them any Nortons.
That's a really good point. Norton was like such a like a state secret for quite a while. Like, you know, it.
So what are your thoughts on the Norton? Because I have mine.
Look, it's as good as the person operating it. For one thing, like at the end of the day, I'm literally actually working on a video right now on something where I do very briefly mention the Norton.
Have you dug into the corruption of the testing?
No, I have heard of the corruption of the testing through a friend of mine who's very big on like US aviation, particularly like bomber development and that sort of thing, and he's got some pretty vocal opinions about.
I have ordered the manual on the I can't remember what it's called, the U.S. Army. It was written in the 56, I think. Of the corruption and procurement or something, where he outlined the Norton and the falsifying data of the trials and all that stuff. When I get it, I'll scan all the pages and I'll send them to you.
Thank you.
It seemed like something interesting enough. Like, I think I want to get this because you never know.
It's pretty obvious that they fudged the numbers though, because when you look at the results of the 8th Air Force when they began their aerial campaigns, you know, in 1943 they had an accuracy of only 16% of bombs landed within 1,000 feet of the target that was displayed.
At the end of the war, and it's interesting because I was in Ukraine last year as well, and I wanted to do a comparison between the Allied bomber war, the strategic bombing campaign during World War II, and the Russian aerial campaign against Ukraine today. Hitting power targets and power plants and civilians and so on and so forth, trying to break it down by the numbers. And it's amazing how passionate some people can get on the pros and cons. Well, you're right. And I'm like, okay, well, these are what the numbers say. So I just did that last week. And it was interesting because you're right. At the end of the war, they spent 24 or $36 billion on bombs, where only 30% of them landed within 1,000 yards of the feet of the target.
Yeah.
And again, the Norton was tested in nice, soft conditions of the desert, 12,000 feet, and they ended up flying 20,000 feet. And only half of the days they flew, they could actually see the ground because of the aerial the cloud cover. Yep. There's just so many things, and the damn thing cost half of the Manhattan Project, which is really interesting.
Yeah. I don't think a lot of people realize how expensive it was.
I certainly didn't think it was that expensive for that thing. But
I mean, look at the cost of developing the B-29. I think that was the most expensive project of the war.
Which was the one that caught fire all the time?
Yeah, the Boeing the Super Fortress. The engines. The engines didn't play nice, basically. Because they had all sorts of cooling issues with their duplex Cyclone engines.
That was the one, yes.
Yeah. I'm pretty certain it was the most expensive, like, individual military program of the war. I'm pretty certain it is. It's the B-29. Definitely more expensive than the Manhattan Project, hilariously. And I mean, it was used to deliver the nuclear bomb, so I suppose they got their money's worth in the end.
Did they use the Norton sight? Because then it was all three.
I think when you're dropping a nuclear device, I don't think it needs to matter if you've landed within 1,000 foot of the target. I think the target is still going. Yeah. You see that city? Yeah, just point it at that in general. You'll be fine.
True. I mean, you know.
Yeah.
Actually, that would be interesting to see if they actually had all three incorporated in that one mission, and then do the math on what that mission actually cost.
Yes, a lot.
Yeah, I was like cost versus benefit.
Yeah,
but well, outstanding. That's another thing we have to. I figure I talked to the Kinnefeld about it, about doing something about the inter-rivalries in the Japanese Army, Air Force, Navy.
Yes.
And I feel like that could be a lot of fun because they would literally stab each other physically.
Oh no, it was not metaphorical hostility; it was a literal hostility between the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. They hated each other. They lied about important, critical information. Like even during stuff like the Guadalcanal campaign, they just omitted telling each other things. Like
the Americans are over there.
Yeah, it boggles. Like the more I learn about it, the more I realize that so many of the times when Japan was kind of defeated by America in various spots, half of it was because the two services just hated each other so much they would rather lose than aid the other.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just utterly insane.
I know if the Navy was going to deliver to a Navy on an island where there's also Army, they wouldn't bring their Army supplies with them because, there must be somebody in Japan that have actually written this. Although Japan is a proud country, I'm not sure anybody would find this funny in Japan, other than we would. But
there's got to be some writing on it. There has to be. Like
in English, I have found nothing.
Yeah.
So when you go to Japan, take a look. See if you can find.
I will.
There's got to be a couple of dudes left from that still
alive. When I'm not soaking up the beautiful scenery. When I'm over there and distracted by all the stuff, I will definitely be trying to dig out some books, which I will then have to pay someone a lot of money to translate.
Yeah, I don't know how Google Translate will do on Japanese.
I've tried. It does not. It doesn't do a good job.
I didn't think so. Where are you going in Japan? What's the plan?
Everywhere. No, I honestly don't know. That part of my world trip hasn't been planned out at all.
You have to see
it's probably one of the last places that I'm doing because I'm doing like a circumnavigation going, from Australia to America, then Europe and everything. And Japan's like my last kind of major stop before I fly back down here.
And Australia is so far away that when you leave, you may as well you have to see everything, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's so expensive to leave Australia. You might as well if you're gonna leave for a holiday, get as much done as you can. I am very sad that I won't be able to go and see any of the crazy stuff that you would see in Russian air museums and that sort of thing. Like that's like one day I want to go over there. Mostly, and I'm ashamed to say this, not even for the planes, it's for the tanks.
Yes. Oh dear Lord.
Like the Object 279. I really want to go and see that thing in the flesh.
279.
That's the nuclear tank. The one that they designed to survive a nuclear blast. The crew wouldn't survive, but the tank itself. It's got four sets of tracks and it's got a 130 millimeter long barrel cannon.
Yes. I remember that.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. When you look at what the Russians built, and then the tank with 4 turrets, they just build stuff that is just big and massive, and it's just holy crap.
Yeah.
And the same thing with back to the Air Force thing. Same thing.
Yeah.
It's just I guess it didn't do much Navy-wise on the before around World War II. That really weren't fighting anybody that needed boats for.
No, like the only real sort of they essentially just repurposed like their existing planes for naval missions. They didn't really design much in the way of dedicated anti-naval aircraft. But that is, I will admit, that is a section of Soviet aviation history that I haven't really explored myself, mostly due to a lack of books on the matter. And if I do have a book on the matter, I haven't read it yet because I've got too many.
Also, the Russian Navy, did they do any? They didn't do much during World War II. Maybe some escort duty here and there, maybe for supply ships.
I'll ask Kinnefeld. I'm sure he could tell me a lot about that, actually.
Yeah, I was thinking about. I was thinking about it, but there's just relatively little river crafts.
Yeah, the boats which have got T-34 turrets on them.
Yeah, they like those.
I love those ones.
I know. I saw there's a few of those. There's one of those sitting in Kiev, and I always kept like, can I just crawl inside this, like just for the hell of it? But I want to go see the mouse.
Yeah,
and the little Kugelpanzer they have.
Oh, I love that thing.
Yeah. I know, right?
I'll definitely be visiting that next year.
And then we have to see. There's a possibility. It is claimed. It is rumored that they have a French chassis. Not chassis, chassis. There's only 10 of them made, and the Russians have nicked one in Berlin and restored it, or they are restoring it. It is in the section that they won't show people.
Yeah.
Yet.
Well, our claim to fame down here is in Brisbane. We've got a German tank from World War One, the A7V or whatever it is, and we won't give it back because it was in no man's land. And at the end of the war, the Aussies saw it and were like, "Oh yeah, spoils of war. We'll take that."
Of course. Well, you know,
every now and then the Germans ask us really nicely if we can give it back, and they're like, "Nah, mate, she's ours."
The Panzer Museum in Münster, they was talking to the French about getting a Tiger tank from France, and they wanted 1.5 million euros for it, and they didn't have the money. I said, well, call them, say it was yours to begin with, but maybe you shouldn't have left it there. It's so, you can't, Germans have no sense of humor when it comes.
No.
Like, I don't know if you ever sat down with some regular Germans and then played Monty Python's clip of Hitler in Somerset. They want to laugh, but they're afraid to in case other Germans see them. So, like, after Monty Python made fun of Hitler, it's okay to make fun of Hitler now. That was it. That was the turning point, I feel.
Yeah. Monty Python is a good gold standard to follow, I think. As someone who grew up watching Monty Python.
As any young growing person should, at least man, I guess.
It is an excellent cornerstone of comedy, and it teaches you from a young age to avoid small white rabbits because they will kill you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, unless you have the holy hand grenade of Antioch, in which case you're safe.
Of course, and can count to 3,
not 5.
And that was when comedy could be funny and silly and not vulgar and stupid.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
I guess I don't know if we can ever have comedy back. Well, the Germans certainly can. But
yeah. We're serious historians, we swear.
Oh, right. Oh, I when I am in, I meet a lot of historians. Yeah, but the Germans and the Austrians especially, dealing with Austrians who all have like several doctorates, and that they always throw at people, which then I throw my royal title back at them because it's all I got, and they are just impossible. Because it's funny, you go to museums, you go to the archives. No, nothing can be done. No, that's not how it works. No.
Yeah,
it's impossible. It's just, oh my God, they drive me mad. They really drive me mad. I get much better along with Polish historians with whom I have no language in common.
No, that's fair. Like, I think that's the one challenge that I faced the most, I'd say, over the past 12 months is getting various archive access. Because surprisingly enough, I like doing very niche topics and very niche videos. And because that usually means that you have to go like directly to primary sources, I've got to go and visit various archives. And I would say a third of the archives have been really nice. A third have completely stonewalled me. And another third have just not responded.
Latter horror half, are they in Europe by chance?
Yes. That doesn't surprise you, does it?
So I wrote the Austrian National Archive because I was doing research to try to figure out what the Germans were doing in all those underground factories that General Kammer built and the Bergkristall and all those. So I finally got a hold of the head historian for construction during the Second World War in Austria. I said, fine, thank you. What do you have in the construction of these tunnel systems and the bunkers around? I have nothing. I only have what the Austrians built. Like, no, they were built by the Germans. We had nothing to do with it. I'm like, okay. It's like, excuse the hell out of me. I will say, for Austria.
I will say actually the one exception is the Zeppelin Museum. I've had a good experience with them. Like they've been really nice. Yeah. One of the people that sort of does tours and that with them reached out to me about about 2 years ago. They've been really nice.
I mean, some of them are. Fortunately, I get to be able to go visit them and then talk to people in person, which helps.
Yeah.
I think, especially on email, they're certainly not going to give you any quarter because they don't know you're just some schmuck from America.
Yeah, exactly.
And I speak German, so when I show up and I speak German to them and I smile nicely and I bring them coffee, sometimes you get a little further. And when there's no cameras running at all, then you get to. Oh, let me show you what I have in the basement. Come.
Yeah.
But I had another funny one with the Austrians because I found out that the Americans had repatriated all the papers, all the documents they took from Vienna and from Austria in 1945. They repatriated them in 1996.
Okay.
Everything that was, and of course, the Austrian archives have no knowledge of this. Like, what? I mean, I am the head archivist. I know nothing of this.
It's probably still in the box that was sent over, and they probably just put it in a room. They probably just put it in a room, locked the door, and just walked away. And were like, "Yeah, well, it's tomorrow's problem," and then they forgot about it.
Oh my God! It says World War II. Close the door.
Honestly, I reckon that would be just a mountain of papers as well, though. Like, I
put a FOIA into the National Archives to say, could you give me a list of what you gave the Austrians? Because apparently they don't know.
Was it a big list?
I don't know. I haven't gotten it yet because there's like 4 blue-haired historian or archivists in the National Archive that will eventually get to your request, and sometimes you get the wrong box.
I will say the National Archives is probably the most user-friendly experience I've had, like especially like on their official, like on the website, like catalog.archives or whatever it is. Like I wish more ran their online digitized databases like that one, because that is very, very user friendly to navigate and find specific files, and you can filter things by like file types and that as well. So you can see if you can find like any GIFs or like videos and that, and then you try and navigate an archive for something like, say, I don't know, like the French Air Force or something, or Italian archives, and the British archives are a bit hit and miss, but it's like the website hasn't been updated since 2003.
And usually there's a flaw when you submit something. I remember. Yeah,
it's like bad gateway every time you try and get to like another page that isn't the home page. It's like, oh.
But the Bundesarchiv, you only had this. No matter what you look for, there's always just one flash card that comes up and says 9.
Yep. But there's a reason why I haven't covered certain German aircraft that I really want to cover, and it's because I'm still trying to get access to various things, which I'm going to hopefully do when I'm in Europe next year, because doing it in person just seems to be the
I have an archivist, a researcher that goes through archives that I actually give money to find things, because I gave up. I come from a world of shooting guns and blowing things up, negotiating with bureaucrats. No, that'll just see talent skill 1 does not go. No. But it's just I'm still looking for all of this, and I found out by sending a box of donuts to an Air Force base to a major who was nice enough to send me some files. And then we had a little talk, and she was telling me, listen, there's a warehouse, and I can't remember what it's called, a holding facility in America where all agencies and military branches, as they have classified documents, if they don't know what to do with them, They send it there. Nobody goes through it there. It sits there. And there's no money for anybody to declassify this. So there's a warehouse that's been there for decades and just holds papers from all different agencies that they don't know what else to do with. And I'm like, holy fuck. So the Indiana Jones warehouse is real.
It's real, yeah.
And it's not. So since our current president is all bent on releasing old documents, yep. I sent him a very nice letter. Please, pretty please. There's some papers dating back to World War I and World War II I really would like to see, and here's why, and here's where they might be, and could you pretty please? I don't know if anything going to come out of that.
Please allocate just a smidgen, like a little baby amount of funding, just to pay someone to start declassifying it and digitizing it, please.
I'll do it myself. At least most of these are in English.
Yeah, that's true.
But there are so many things sitting in places around the world that, and people think it's a conspiracy always. That why has this not been released? But half of it has not been released because, first of all, no one has any idea where it is or what it is. And there's been no funding for anybody to go through, the 60,000 boxes under the Smithsonian or something.
Yeah. And like each one of those boxes could be a few thousand pages. So, it's a lot of paperwork.
And a lot of it are languages that they don't understand.
Yes. And the pile of paperwork is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger because for a lot of things, you are still making hard copies today of stuff, like for good reason.
Are you going to DC to see the Horton?
Yes.
Was my plan too.
Yes. I know. I'm going to all the big things. The Smithsonian's definitely on my to-do list. Museum of Flying in Seattle, the stuff down in Cali, the Air Zoo, which is in Michigan. I want to say. I'm like, if I've got that wrong, I will be told about it in the comments below. I just know that.
Yes.
And I'm hoping because I'm going to be in the States for several weeks. I'm hoping that during that time I'll be able to go and see a rocket launch or two as well. So
yeah,
that's a big bucket list item. Is I want to see a giant firework go into space.
I wanted to see the Arado. I wrote my friend who worked for the Smithsonian and said it's the only one left. Just take care of it. No hiding it in the basement.
Yes.
That's the Arado. I always liked. I always thought it was such an underrated plane.
It looks nice as well. Like it wasn't a particularly bad looking machine. No. I mean, yes, the earlier ones did need Rato to get off the ground, but
they did they end up with 2 or with 4 engines?
4, 2 on each wing. Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't a bad plane when it came to performance, was it?
No, considering what they wanted out of it, and obviously it fitted the Chanel bomber concept quite well. I mean, honestly, I'm of the opinion that with the whole 262 thing, they should have done. One of the original plans for the 262 was to also make it more of a strike, like a fighter bomber purely, rather than a fighter. But that's a topic I can waffle on for far too many hours. Because I've got some very expensive textbooks on the ME262 in the other room, which cost a small fortune for me to acquire.
Well, I did you do an episode on the 262 yet?
No, that's one of those. So there are some aircraft, like all the really big ticket ones, like your ME262s, your Spitfires, your P-51 Mustangs. I'm like, how can I do this plane justice without my project devolving into a 10-hour, 5-part insane marathon? Because I'm one of those people where if I feel like I'm leaving out information, I hate it, which is why my videos have gradually gone from, 10-minute videos to, here's a 3-hour video on the Dornier DOX instead, kind of thing.
And you can't do the 262 without talking about Hitler, Messerschmitt, Goering, and Milch.
Yeah, because you need that context. You need the context. You can't just talk about the plane. You need to talk about all the things that led to it and affected its developments, and particularly when it comes to, your early prototype jets, and especially the Wunderwaffe stuff and everything that was done by the Germans, and to an extent the Japanese as well. The Italians didn't do much Wunderwaffering, actually, because they didn't really have the capacity to do so, because they were like, we're just trying to
waffling out of there.
Exactly.
But the book Wunderwaffe was written by Igor Vykovsky, who's a friend of mine. So if you ever want to talk to him about that or have him on, just let me know.
I will. You know what? I'm actually going to write a note on that, because that would be really cool.
I'm sensing another Post-it.
No, this is one of like 15 million notebooks that I've got, because
I think I have 6 or 9 different digital things, aggregates that can remind me of things, and instead my computer screens are surrounded by Post-its.
No, you see, living in tropical Queensland, my office, when I'm not in here, the heat and cold change always makes the Post-its just fall off everything, so I just gave up using them.
Oh,
because it's either, you know, it can be as cool as 10 or 15 C in here, and then during the hottest part of the day, if the aircon isn't running, this office gets over 38 C, because this house has the insulation of a cardboard box.
I see.
It's why I'm buying an apartment in the middle of the city later on this year, because at least that thing is climate controlled.
All right. And when you do the 262 episode, do let me know when you have it all fresh in mind. So maybe you want to come on and we can do a chat, and you can
absolutely. I
am all in favor of long, detailed, nerdy episodes, because this whole I do 56, one every week for my channel.
Yeah.
And then I do 20 episodes for TV. 20 episodes for TV has to be 45 minutes, cut to commercials with graphics and intro. And there's a 45 minutes. I don't know. I don't know if I can confine myself to that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, I hate the short ones. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to do YouTube, because I can do 2-3 hour episodes and really go through a location and really show everybody what it looks like. And I hate the TV episodes because I can't. Because I'm sitting there with the editor going like, well, you cut that out. You cut this thing out. And he's like, yes, but no one cares. We have to take the best stuff. And I think it's all good stuff.
And that is why I think YouTube and online media will be the death of television, for that reason, because you know, like I do like 3 hour glorified lectures on aviation, and it gets over 1 million views. So clearly people are wanting to know all the nitty gritty stuff.
I know,
you know, and if we can do a 3 hour videos ourselves on it, it's like, why not? You know,
I mean, I don't watch videos when it says 15 minutes, 10 minutes. But like, I know that the topic you're going to be talking about cannot be covered in a 10-15 minute video. So you can get to the rudimentary, but no, give me the 2, 3, 4 hour lecture all day long.
It's just finding enough hours in the day to do all the research, and then the scripting, and then the video editing, and the recording, and
I had to do a speech on a lecture at a fortress summit, his military fortress summit in Ukraine last year. Like, well, you just, you know, maybe you have 30 minutes to talk about this. I'm like, 30 minutes?
Oh no!
Look, I can't introduce myself in under 25. It's like, I'm not capable. And it's like, all right, well, I'll try to keep it short. I only had like a couple places to talk about. An hour and 20 later, I'm still talking, and organizers like, but they keep asking me questions. What can I do? I'm sorry.
No, you are overqualified with that, because my public speaking qualifications are not very good. I need to get better at doing that. I need to do like more. I this year I'm going to try and do like live streamed historical discussions this year to kind of dip my toe into that a bit more. But someone, one of my friends who works at one of the museums in the States was like, oh yeah, you know, when you're over next year, we'll organize like, you know, a meet and greet event where you can talk to like a bunch of people about stuff on a podium. I'm like, excuse me? That is like the most terrifying thing anyone has said to me in about 10 years.
I think you're doing great. I mean, no, I'm like, then you write yourself a whole lot of notes preparing for these things, and I promise you won't actually look at them, but you'll feel better having them. I started writing
revision notes,
bullet points, because when I start talking, I'm counting that I will remember anything anyway, because there's nothing worse than having somebody looking around reading up from
Yeah.
Much for just look at people, just let it go, and you know what you're talking about, and then just talk.
Yeah.
And if not, you'll just bring in a puppy and like, look, puppy.
The bullet points for me are going to be good just so that I stay on topic, because I might in the middle of a sentence I might get distracted by something and be like, yes, let's go on a 45-minute tangent about this very niche thing that's only vaguely related to the topic that we're discussing.
But those are usually the best ones.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, we think so, but we're nerds, and we're not the woman sitting next to the guy going like, "What the hell was he on about?"
It's like, look, we're very passionate about this.
Yes. It's very... this little screw that goes in this slot that sits underneath this track is really important.
Yes, exactly.
Oh God, what was it? I had a friend like that, and we were sitting in a. We were flying out to a reenactment actually.
Oh, okay.
A D-Day reenactment, and behind us was a B-17 pilot, a young B-17 in the new B-17, and they sort of take on the persona of the World War II pilots and planes and name them the same, and a lot of reenactors, they will take on the persona of somebody that was. And he started talking to my friend who's a nerd brain, David. He is no more. And he was like, oh, your plane. Oh, the plane you're flying. Oh, yes. During World War II, he was attacked by a Stuka pilot whose name was so-and-so. And he did it just the day after his wife's birthday, where he just came back from Berlin. And her name was, and they were living outside Brandenburg. And I'm looking like, holy fuck. And he's talking 15 minutes. Like, you just remember this?
Yep. No,
and,
yeah.
But you love people like that because they're entertaining.
Yeah, it's really embarrassing because like I've always been so aviation obsessed for like years and years and years and years and years, and yet all of the most interesting facts that I can pull out of my brain, 1% is aviation related, I would say. It's like other things just get buried in my head instead, and I have to just try and remember what I read from a book 2 years ago instead.
I mean, I'm happily single. I'm single, so occasionally I'll go on a date, and occasionally I'll go on online dating because I'm always working, so I don't go to. You're not going to find me at a bar. And I'm looking at some of these profiles, and go like documentaries. Ooh, we made like conspiracies. All right, fine. Let's go on a date. Let's talk.
Yeah. I know exactly how you feel.
I mean, and I was on a date and some time ago, and I never saw her again. That's probably why. Yeah. But she said, "What do you really think happened to Kennedy?" Oh, let me explain to you.
Well, pull up a seat. Do you have 3 hours later? Because,
there's no chance of this ending in romance, but it's a really interesting conversation.
Yeah.
I think historians need more groupies. I think.
Yep. We'll get there. We'll get there.
All right, buddy. This was fun. We should do this.
This was really fun. Definitely. I really want to.
We found a time slot that works.
Yeah, so I found with people on the West Coast, like my late morning into early afternoon is best because it's sort of your evening. Whereas if we do it like the other way around,
it got dark here since we started.
It did, yes. But if we do it the other way around, for whatever reason, the time zone is a bit weirder.
It is.
Because I think if we do like my evening, it's like 4 a.m. in the morning for you. It's stupid early. So my late morning for your early afternoon is definitely going to be the best way. But no, we definitely need to do this again.
Absolutely. I'm gonna inflict this conversation on Drac and on the Chieftain, and then maybe we should all four go on one and then talk about it all in one big mess.
Yes.
Which would probably take several days.
I would be absolutely keen to do that because I've got some other collaborations planned with some people this year. Someone like more of a kind of like a more serious discussion, like historical discussion, like we're doing today. But I've also got some videos planned where me and some other people on YouTube are doing more kind of fun collaborations. Like one thing we're doing is doing an aviation tier list, where we're going to be ranking the various planes from World War II with some controversial takes, which will which will probably result in a lot of armchair historians furiously typing into the comments below.
That there has to be room for some doing it in a humorous way.
Oh, you've got to keep it somewhat humorous to be entertaining, because like a lot of what we study and what we get interested in, it's a really dry topic.
It is
and you've got to find ways to inject some human interest into it, and humor is honestly the best way to do it. Like,
and like I like Hard Thrasher, the way he does things. Occasionally Laser Pig. I mean, sometimes there has to be a little bit of lightness to it.
Those two are some of the ones I've press ganged into the aircraft tier list video. Actually,
I'm actually going to have to reach out to Hard Thrasher, because he did some research on one of my Nazi scientists, where it seemed that he may have gotten something from a different source than I have.
Okay, yeah. Did you see the video that we did on the Elbonian videos, where we did a couple of live streams where we were like suggesting excellent but also very crap vehicles and planes and stuff to give to El Jefe and the Elbonian government and that? Yes.
Were you involved in the one Perun did as well?
No, so I was involved with the one that Hard Thrasher did, and then the History of Everything hosted the most recent one, which was a couple of months ago. That resulted in some ideas that were so hilarious that we've now turned them into merchandise in a store that I'm launching at the end of this month. I'll send you a link to the specific one that I'm talking about, because there are a couple of bits like it was a lot of fun. But that like bunch of collab stuff planned for this year now that I've got some free time, because I've along with doing this, I've been working a full-time contract job for the past 11 months, and that wraps up at the end of this month. And I'm going back to historianing and YouTubing full-time again. So
God, I trust the good Lord to save us some full-time jobs.
Because I think in the past 12 months, I've uploaded only like 10 videos, if that, because I've literally been working, 48-hour weeks. So
the whole once a week, sometimes it does sometimes get to be not a whole lot of life.
Yes, I wanted a bit more work-life balance.
Time to go out. I got to edit this. And I've noticed that revenue in the summer goes. I don't know, is that just me or is that everybody? Revenue in YouTube in the summer goes down and goes up over winter.
So for me, I've noticed this could also be seasonal for me, but 40% of my audience is in the States. I would say it drops off. So basically you it climbs up a little bit towards Easter time, dips off after Easter, kind of coincides with one of the financial quarters. It's kind of normal through the middle of the year, which is your summertime, kind of like baseline. And then from July until a week before Christmas, it just ramps up and up and up and up and up and up, as obviously the ad revenue gets more valuable, because you've got things like, Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Christmas, and all of that. And then on December the 24th, it falls to the floor.
Pretty much. Yep. That's pretty much it.
Yep.
Yeah. And in the summer, people are partying and like sitting by the beach and doing other stuff. Yeah. This is where I would say that COVID was really good money.
Yeah. COVID was insane. Like,
can we just lock everybody up for a couple of months?
Mandatory YouTube watching hours every day.
I know. It's like if people are, COVID was terrible. Like, are you kidding? I got 4 new cars.
No, I got very lucky with it, because I think if I tried doing the channel after COVID, it wouldn't have done as well. Like I think I timed starting what I do on YouTube like really well.
I started the year before, a couple of years before, but I really didn't start going out. And then I started with my series, The Last Nazi Secret, where I crawled through looking at what people were, what we don't know, and that just rocketed in 2020 and then 2021. It was awesome. And it's like 5 years later, people are like, do we get more of those? I'm like, well, I can only give you the secrets that I can find. Are you ever going to do more from Lisa? Like, what? I covered all of them. They're not doing it.
There's no more. There is a limit.
It's like I'm not going to start making it up.
Yeah.
So you got to wait until I get stuff from the archives. Until then, I'm forcing World War I on people because World War I is interesting, and the forts, the Alpine forts of World War I.
Oh,
they're so cool.
No.
Except I noticed one thing with Alpine forts that really annoys the piss out of me. They're always way up there, away from the parking lot.
Yes, you got to get some exercise.
You can never drive through the bloody things.
Nope.
Location.
You got to haul your camera gear up a mountainside.
Yes.
At least it means you can have like a nice big fattening meal in the evening and not feel bad about it because you've already, done a heap of walking that day.
I'm going to look forward to the Alpine forts this year because I tore my Achilles 5 months ago. So this is going to be really fun.
Fun.
See how that goes.
I don't envy you.
Well, they told me all the cool kids would tear their Achilles, and it was just the in thing to do. So I figured I had to try.
Yep.
They were wrong.
Right. But no, we should definitely do more collabs. So I'd be definitely down to do more. And as of like mid next month, I'll have a lot more free time on my hands as well. Yeah. So that'll make things easier.
And next year when you're going to Europe too. We'll talk about all this stuff later. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
This will probably be how the internet finds out that I'm doing a world tour next year because I've only so far advertised this on Patreon. So, what do you mean Rex is traveling? Where's he going? What's he doing?
Well, I do it every year, so people have sort of figured it out by now.
Yep. Exactly. I plan to do a lot more. But yes, give me ideas for collabs and we shall do it.
Outstanding. Will do.
Yes.
All right. You have a good day, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's lunchtime. I'll probably go and it's actually technically just past lunchtime, but yes, I'll go get some food, hit up the gym, then come back and finish editing a video that should have been finished 9 days ago, but work things happened. Yeah.
Well, I have to premiere an episode in 3 days that I'm only half done with, so I figure I'm going to go sit in the jacuzzi for an hour first and think about it.
Yeah, I understand that sentiment all too well.
I have to think about these things.
Yeah. They're like, oh, Rex, like you're really organized with your like videos and everything. I'm like, you kidding? I'm a ball of anxiety sitting in the corner of my library going, why isn't this done yet?
Cutting it last minute, trying to upload it, hoping to God YouTube's not going to need to review the footage first.
Oh, God. If like sometimes like where you've spent like 2 weeks editing a 2-hour video and then YouTube goes, oh, by the way, this footage that you paid to get the license for still isn't allowed on here. I'm like, did I really just waste a few $100 on a video license that isn't going to work?
I have got, whenever I run into that, most of the time is like, guys, this is public domain. It's released in this and this and this and this museum. Knock it off. And they knock it off. But of course, when I talk war, I mean, if I do war, Nazis, Hitler, secrets, I'm going to be flagged for review. But usually they have gotten pretty good with now we'll get a review. It is done in a day or two. Yeah. And it always comes through. There's only once where it's like, well, you have pictures of war. Yeah. Do you have any idea what do I do here? There's pictures of war. It's educational. So I actually copy and paste their own rules. Of, well, if it's an educational in context and not overly I can use it. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. So there are 2 steps to review. If the first one says no, you can appeal once more, and to somebody who actually may have a brain. Yes. Yes. All right, buddy. Go get some breakfast.
Yep, I will. Thank you for having me on, and let us continue to do this.
Absolutely.
All right.
Toodles.
I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel, liking, follows, and maybe even join me on Patreon to help out. I am just a guy, a historian, traveling around all these historic places in Europe on my own dime, trying to bring them to you.